Hey everyone! Tonight we're traveling back to the ancient world of Greece once again, where the sea carried not only ships, but also stories that have survived for more than 3,000 years. If you've been following our Greek mythology series, welcome back. And if this is your very first journey with us, you're in for one of the greatest legends ever told. Tonight we'll discover the complete story of Perseus, the legendary hero who defeated the terrifying Medusa, rescued Princess Andromeda from a sea monster, and unknowingly fulfilled a prophecy that no king could ever escape. This is a tale filled with gods, monsters, forgotten kingdoms, impossible quests, and the timeless belief that fate always finds its way. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift back to an age when every mountain belonged to a god, every island held a mystery, and every voyage beyond the horizon promised a new legend waiting to be born. Long before Perseus became one of the greatest heroes in all of Greek mythology, before anyone had ever spoken his name, there stood a prosperous kingdom in the northeastern corner of the Peloponnese known as Argos. Surrounded by fertile valleys, gentle rivers, and rolling hills covered with olive groves, Argos was among the oldest and most respected kingdoms in the Greek world. High above the city rose a magnificent stone citadel, where generations of kings had ruled beneath the protection of the Olympian gods. Its marketplaces were filled with merchants arriving from distant islands, bronze craftsmen worked tirelessly beside glowing furnaces, and shepherds guided their flocks across peaceful hills that overlooked the sparkling waters of the Aegean Sea. To ordinary people, Argos appeared blessed by both fortune and the gods themselves. Yet behind the strong walls of the royal palace lived a king whose greatest fear had nothing to do with invading armies or failing harvests. His name was King Acrisius, and although he possessed wealth, power, and a peaceful kingdom, one question troubled him more deeply with every passing year. He had no son to inherit his throne. His only child was a beautiful young daughter named Danae. And in the ancient Greek world, many kings believed that the future of their dynasty depended upon a male heir. As the years passed and Danae grew into adulthood, Acrisius became increasingly anxious about what would happen after his death. Like many rulers throughout Greek mythology, he eventually sought answers not from his advisors or generals, but from the gods themselves. In ancient Greece, whenever kings faced questions that no human wisdom could answer, they often travelled to the sacred sanctuary of Delphi, home of the most famous oracle in the ancient world. Perched high upon the rocky slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Temple of Apollo attracted visitors from every corner of Greece and far beyond. Kings, generals, merchants, and ordinary farmers alike climbed the winding mountain paths, hoping to hear even a single sentence that might reveal something about their future. Yet the Oracle of Delphi rarely gave simple answers. Her prophecies were mysterious, symbolic, and often understood only after events had already unfolded. King Acrisius entered the sacred temple carrying generous gifts for Apollo, expecting perhaps to hear that a son would soon be born, or that his kingdom would enjoy many years of prosperity. Instead, the prophecy he received would change the course of countless lives forever. The oracle declared that Acrisius would never have a son. Worse still, she revealed that one day he would be killed by his own grandson, the future son of Danae. The words echoed through the silent temple like distant thunder. To modern ears, the prophecy might seem almost impossible to believe, but to the ancient Greeks, such warnings carried enormous weight. Time and again, their myths reminded them that the gods could see beyond the limits of ordinary human understanding. Terrified by what he had heard, King Acrisius left Delphi with only one thought filling his mind. If Danae never married, if she never had children, then perhaps the prophecy could never come true. Upon returning to Argos, Acrisius made a decision that would forever define his place in Greek mythology. Refusing to trust fate, he ordered the construction of a magnificent yet inescapable prison for his own daughter. Deep beneath the royal palace, craftsmen built a great chamber made entirely of bronze and solid stone. No windows looked toward the outside world. No staircase led upward to freedom. Only a single heavily guarded entrance allowed food and water to reach the lonely room below the earth. Danae, innocent of any crime, was taken into this underground prison simply because her father feared a future that had not yet happened. Ancient Greek myths often reveal a painful truth about human nature. Those who struggle most desperately against destiny frequently become the very people who bring it to life. King Acrisius believed he had defeated the prophecy through careful planning and absolute control. No man could enter the bronze chamber, no husband could meet Danae, no child could ever be born. Satisfied that the future had finally been secured, the king continued ruling Argos, while his daughter spent her days alone, beneath the palace, separated from sunlight, fresh air, and the ordinary life she had once known. Yet even the strongest walls built by mortal hands have never been capable of keeping out the gods. Far above Mount Olympus, Zeus, ruler of the heavens and king of the Olympian gods, looked down upon the world of mortals. Throughout Greek mythology, Zeus often intervened in human affairs, sometimes rewarding acts of courage, sometimes punishing arrogance, and sometimes simply following desires that even the other gods struggled to understand. According to the ancient legend, Zeus became captivated by Danae, despite the impossible prison created to isolate her from the world. No ordinary door could admit him, and no hidden passage existed beneath the palace. But Zeus required neither keys nor gateways. One quiet night, as Danae sat alone within the silence of her bronze chamber, a brilliant light suddenly appeared overhead. Through the narrow opening where only a little fresh air entered, a gentle shower of golden rain slowly descended into the room. It shimmered like countless drops of liquid sunlight, filling the underground chamber with a warm golden glow, unlike anything Danae had ever seen. This miraculous golden rain was Zeus himself, taking a form no wall or prison could ever stop. Ancient artists would later paint this extraordinary moment upon pottery, temple walls, and frescoes throughout Greece, making it one of the most famous scenes in all of classical mythology. In time, Danae became pregnant, and months later gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Perseus. For a short while, mother and child remained hidden within the underground chamber. Danae cared for her infant as best she could, despite the harsh conditions of their strange prison. Yet babies cannot remain silent forever. One day, King Acrisius heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying beneath the palace. Filled with shock and growing fear, he hurried into the underground chamber, where he discovered the impossible truth standing before him. Danae held a newborn son in her arms. Everything the king believed impossible had somehow come to pass. Furious and terrified, he demanded to know the child's father. When Danae answered that Zeus himself had visited her in the form of golden rain, Acrisius refused to believe, or perhaps feared believing, such an extraordinary claim. Yet even now he hesitated. Killing his own daughter and grandson outright might anger the gods if the child truly carried the blood of Olympus. Once again, the king searched for a solution that would protect him from the prophecy without openly committing an act that could invite divine punishment. In doing so, he unknowingly took the next step toward the very future he hoped to avoid. Rather than ordering their execution, Acrisius commanded his servants to build a large wooden chest, strong enough to survive upon the open sea. Danae and the infant Perseus were placed inside, together with only a few simple provisions, before the heavy lid was nailed shut. At dawn, beneath a quiet sky and calm waters, the wooden chest was carried down to the shoreline. Without ceremony, without farewell, the king ordered it pushed into the sea. Slowly the waves carried the chest farther from the coast of Argos, until it became little more than a small dark shape drifting upon the endless blue water. Acrisius watched until it disappeared beyond the horizon, believing at last that he had escaped the prophecy spoken years earlier at Delphi. Yet the sea has always belonged more to Poseidon than to mortal kings, and the gods had no intention of allowing the story of Perseus to end before it had truly begun. Alone upon the open sea, a frightened mother held her sleeping child close, while the wooden chest rose and fell gently with each passing wave. Far ahead, beyond the endless horizon, destiny was already preparing the next chapter in the life of the boy who would one day become the legendary slayer of Medusa. The small wooden chest drifted endlessly across the open waters of the Aegean Sea, rising and falling with every gentle wave, as though the sea itself had become a cradle, carrying mother and child toward an unknown destiny. Inside the cramped darkness, Danae held the infant Perseus tightly against her chest, whispering soft prayers to Zeus, Poseidon, and every god who might still hear the cries of a frightened mother abandoned far from land. She had no idea how many days had already passed. Sometimes brilliant sunlight warmed the wooden walls until the air inside became almost unbearable. At other times, cold winds swept across the sea, rocking the chest so violently that she feared each wave might be their last. Food slowly disappeared. Fresh water became precious beyond measure. Yet despite every hardship, the sea never claimed them. Ancient Greek storytellers often believed that when the gods had chosen someone for a great destiny, even nature itself quietly bent to preserve that life. Gentle currents carried the chest farther east, while unseen winds kept it from the deadly storms that frequently destroyed ordinary merchant ships. Looking back many centuries later, it almost seems as though every wave understood that inside this simple wooden box rested a child, whose name would one day become one of the greatest in all of Greek mythology. For now, however, Perseus remained only a sleeping infant, completely unaware that his extraordinary journey had already begun before he could even walk. Eventually, after drifting for what may have been several days, the wooden chest approached the peaceful island of Seriphos, one of the many small islands scattered across the sparkling Aegean Sea. Unlike the mighty kingdom of Argos, Seriphos was quiet and humble. Rocky hills rose above narrow beaches, where fishermen launched their simple boats before sunrise each morning. Small farms covered the gentler valleys, while white stone cottages overlooked sheltered coves, where the sea remained calm for much of the year. Life moved slowly here. The people depended upon fishing, farming, and the generosity of the surrounding waters, rather than royal wealth or military power. On the morning that fate finally brought Danae and Perseus to the island, an elderly fisherman named Dictys was preparing his nets, as he had done almost every day of his life. Before the sun climbed high above the sea, he noticed an unusual object drifting slowly toward the shore. At first he assumed it to be wreckage from a merchant ship caught in some distant storm. Curious, he rowed his small fishing boat toward it. As he drew nearer, however, he heard something that immediately caused him to stop rowing. From inside the sealed wooden chest came the faint cry of a baby. Without hesitation, Dictys pulled the heavy chest alongside his boat and carefully forced open its lid. To his astonishment, he discovered a frightened young woman holding a small child, both exhausted but still alive. Ancient Greek culture placed enormous importance upon hospitality and compassion towards strangers. Believing that any traveller might unknowingly be under the protection of the gods, Dictys welcomed the unexpected visitors without asking for payment or reward. He carried them safely back to shore, offering them shelter inside his own modest home, overlooking the quiet harbour of Seriphos. Life upon the island slowly returned to something resembling peace. Danae, who had spent months imprisoned beneath the palace of Argos, and then days drifting helplessly across the sea, finally experienced freedom once again. Though Dictys possessed little wealth, he shared everything he had. His small house became a true home for mother and son, filled not with luxury but with kindness. Perseus spent his earliest childhood running along quiet beaches, climbing rocky hills, and watching fishermen return each evening with their boats full of silver fish glistening beneath the setting sun. Unlike many princes raised inside royal palaces, Perseus grew up surrounded by ordinary people who worked honestly for their living. He learned to mend fishing nets before he ever touched a sword. He watched the changing winds with experienced sailors and listened to old fishermen tell stories about hidden islands, dangerous currents, and mysterious creatures believed to live beneath the sea. Every evening, as darkness settled across the island, Danae quietly told her son stories about the kingdom he had never seen, about his grandfather's fear, and about the strange prophecy that had changed both of their lives forever. She never allowed hatred to fill the boy's heart. Instead, she taught him that a person's worth was measured not by revenge, but by courage, kindness, and wisdom. These lessons would remain with Perseus long after he left the peaceful island where he had spent his childhood. Years passed quietly upon Seriphos, and the small child rescued from the sea gradually became a strong and capable young man. Perseus possessed remarkable physical strength, but those who knew him admired something else even more deeply. He treated the elderly with respect, worked harder than anyone expected, and never hesitated to help neighbours whenever storms damaged fishing boats or poor harvests left families struggling. The islanders soon came to view him almost as one of their own sons. Although Perseus never received the formal education of a prince, life itself became his teacher. The rugged hills strengthened his body. Long hours spent rowing beside experienced fishermen developed remarkable endurance. Hunting wild goats across steep cliffs sharpened both his patience and his aim. Danae often watched proudly as her son grew taller with each passing year, seeing more and more of Zeus's quiet confidence reflected in his character. Yet despite the peaceful rhythm of island life, destiny had not forgotten the child drifting inside the wooden chest. Far beyond Seriphos, the great kingdoms of Greece continued their endless struggles for power, while upon Mount Olympus, the gods silently watched the young man whose future remained closely tied to prophecies spoken long before his birth. Unfortunately, the greatest danger awaiting Perseus did not arrive from across the sea, but lived much closer to home. The ruler of Seriphos was King Polydectes, the older brother of the kindly fisherman Dictys. Unlike his humble brother, Polydectes possessed wealth, authority, and the confidence of a man accustomed to having every wish obeyed. At first, he welcomed Danae politely, grateful that his brother had shown generosity towards strangers. Yet, as the years passed, the king became increasingly captivated by Danae's beauty and hoped to make her his wife. Danae, however, refused his advances again and again. She had already endured imprisonment because of one man's fear and had no desire to surrender her freedom to another man's ambition. Perseus, now fully grown, recognized the king's intentions almost immediately. Whenever Polydectes visited the house overlooking the harbour, Perseus remained close beside his mother, his quiet presence making it impossible for the king to pressure her openly. Although Polydectes hid his frustration behind polite smiles, resentment slowly grew within him. He realized that as long as Perseus remained upon the island, Danae would never accept his proposal. Like Peleus before him in the story of Jason, Polydectes began searching for a way to remove the troublesome young hero without appearing openly cruel. Ancient Greek mythology repeatedly reminds us that some of the greatest dangers faced by heroes come not from monsters, but from clever rulers who hide deadly intentions beneath friendly words. One evening, while watching the sun slowly disappear beneath the western sea, Polydectes finally believed he had found the perfect solution. He announced that he intended to marry another noblewoman and invited every respected man upon the island to attend a magnificent royal banquet. According to local custom, each guest would be expected to bring a valuable wedding gift suitable for a king. The invitation seemed completely ordinary, and no one suspected anything unusual. Perseus himself gladly accepted, unaware that he had just stepped into a carefully prepared trap. Polydectes had no interest whatsoever in marrying another woman. The entire celebration existed for only one purpose: to place Perseus in a position where pride, honor, and generosity might be used against him. As preparations for the feast continued throughout the kingdom, the king quietly smiled to himself. He believed that before many days had passed, the young man who had protected Danae for so many years would willingly leave Seriphos forever, in pursuit of a task no ordinary mortal could possibly survive. The peaceful childhood of Perseus was about to end, and the adventure that would one day make him immortal in Greek legend was finally ready to begin. The day of King Polydectes' magnificent banquet arrived beneath a cloudless Mediterranean sky, and from the very first light of dawn, the peaceful island of Seriphos seemed transformed into a place of celebration. Colourful banners fluttered from the stone walls of the royal palace, while servants hurried through the narrow streets carrying baskets filled with fresh bread, ripe olives, fragrant herbs, roasted lamb, sweet figs, and jars of the island's finest wine. Fishermen tied their boats securely within the harbour before putting on their best cloaks. Craftsmen closed their workshops earlier than usual, and nobles from neighbouring villages slowly climbed the winding road leading toward the palace overlooking the sea. Throughout the island, everyone spoke of the king's grand feast, believing they would soon witness another joyful royal marriage. No one realized that the celebration itself was little more than a carefully designed trap, prepared not for a bride, but for a young hero who had unknowingly become an obstacle to the king's desires. Perseus, dressed simply as always, walked beside his mother before leaving her safely at home. Danae smiled proudly as she watched her son disappear toward the palace, never imagining that before the sun had set, he would accept a journey far more dangerous than either of them could possibly imagine. Life upon Seriphos had been peaceful for many years, yet the quiet rhythm that had shaped Perseus's childhood was about to end forever. The gods had watched patiently while the boy rescued from the sea grew into a man. Now, at last, the moment appointed by destiny had quietly arrived. Inside the great hall of the palace, long wooden tables stretched from one end of the chamber to the other beneath rows of bronze lamps whose warm light reflected across polished stone floors. Musicians softly played gentle melodies, while servants welcomed guests with cups of wine mixed according to ancient Greek custom. One after another, the noblemen of Seriphos approached King Polydectes, carrying elaborate wedding gifts worthy of a royal celebration. Some presented magnificent horses with beautifully braided manes. Others offered finely crafted bronze armor decorated with intricate engravings. Wealthy merchants carried chests filled with silver coins, delicate jewelry, rare perfumes imported from distant islands, or colorful woven cloth brought by trading ships from the eastern Mediterranean. Every guest bowed respectfully before placing his offering at the king's feet. Polydectes thanked each man warmly, smiling with apparent generosity, while quietly waiting for only one guest in particular. Finally, Perseus entered the hall. Unlike the wealthy nobles surrounding him, he carried nothing. Growing up in the modest home of Dictys had taught him honesty rather than luxury. And despite years of hard work, he possessed no treasure suitable for a king. As conversations gradually faded into silence, every eye turned toward the young man standing alone before the throne. Polydectes welcomed him with a smile so carefully rehearsed that no ordinary observer would have recognized the hidden satisfaction behind it. "Perseus," the king said pleasantly, "surely a young man as honorable as yourself has not forgotten the custom of bringing a wedding gift." A deep silence settled across the great hall. Perseus looked around at the magnificent presence already surrounding the throne before quietly lowering his eyes. He felt no shame in being poor, yet he deeply respected the traditions of hospitality that shaped Greek society. Standing before so many distinguished guests with empty hands embarrassed him more than he expected. Ancient Greek culture placed enormous importance upon honor, generosity, and public reputation. A man's word carried almost as much value as his wealth, and promises made before witnesses were rarely forgotten. Polydectes understood this perfectly. Watching Perseus struggle to answer, he gently continued speaking in a voice calm enough to appear almost sympathetic. "Do not worry," he said. "I know you possess little gold. Bring whatever gift you believe worthy of your king." Perseus remained silent for another moment before finally lifting his head. Pride, youth, and sincerity all combined within his answer. "Your Majesty," he replied, "if I possessed horses, I would gladly offer horses. If I possessed silver, I would gladly offer silver, but I own neither. Instead, I give you my word. Whatever gift you desire, if it lies within my power to obtain it, I shall bring it to you." Quiet murmurs spread among the assembled guests. Some admired the young man's courage, others feared he had spoken too quickly. King Polydectes smiled. This was exactly the promise he had been waiting to hear. The king allowed several long moments to pass before answering, as though carefully considering what gift might truly please him. Then, looking directly into Perseus's eyes, he spoke the words that would become one of the most famous challenges in all of Greek mythology. "Very well," he said softly. "If you insist upon offering whatever I ask, then bring me the head of Medusa." Instantly, the entire hall fell silent. Cups stopped halfway toward waiting lips. Musicians lowered their instruments. Even experienced soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone in Greece knew the name Medusa. Parents frightened children with stories of the terrible Gorgon, whose single glance could turn the strongest warrior into lifeless stone. Sailors whispered her name only reluctantly while traveling through unfamiliar waters, believing that speaking too freely about monsters might somehow invite misfortune. Medusa lived far beyond the lands known to ordinary Greeks, in a place so distant and dangerous that few believed any human had ever returned from searching for her. The request was not merely difficult, it was impossible. Perseus himself had never seen Medusa, yet he had heard countless stories since childhood. Hair made entirely of living snakes, bronze hands sharper than swords, golden wings that carried her across lonely cliffs, eyes capable of freezing life itself into silent stone. No ordinary man could approach such a creature and survive. Yet before the entire court he had already pledged his honor. Refusing now would stain his reputation forever. Polydectes understood that perfectly. Although surprised by the request, Perseus never withdrew the promise he had made. Looking calmly toward the king, he nodded once. "Then I shall bring you the head of Medusa." Many of the guests stared at him in disbelief. Some quietly admired such fearless determination. Others pitied the young hero, convinced they had just witnessed a brave man unknowingly accepting his own death sentence. Only Dictys, standing silently near the back of the hall, recognized his brother's true intentions. He knew Polydectes never expected Perseus to return alive. Once the troublesome young man disappeared across the sea, Danae would remain alone upon Seriphos, free from the only person who had successfully protected her for so many years. Yet before Dictys could speak, the banquet continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Laughter slowly returned. Wine continued flowing across the tables. Musicians resumed their gentle melodies. Only Perseus remained strangely quiet, his thoughts already drifting far beyond the palace walls toward lands he had never seen. Somewhere in the unknown corners of the world lived a monster unlike any other. Somehow he would have to find her. Somehow he would have to survive long enough to return. And somehow he would have to accomplish what no hero before him had ever achieved. That evening, after leaving the palace, Perseus walked alone beside the quiet shoreline, where gentle waves rolled softly against the rocks beneath a sky overflowing with countless stars. The peaceful island that had always felt so familiar now seemed strangely different. Every fishing boat resting peacefully within the harbour reminded him of childhood. Every narrow path climbing the hills carried memories of happier, simpler days. He knew that by accepting the king's challenge, he had almost certainly said farewell to everything he had ever known. Eventually, he returned to the small house overlooking the sea, where Danae immediately noticed the unusual silence upon her son's face. Gently, she asked what troubled him. Perseus hesitated only briefly before telling her everything. As she listened, the colour slowly disappeared from her face. She understood King Polydectes far better than her son did. This had never been about a wedding gift. It had always been about removing Perseus forever. For the first time since escaping Argos inside the drifting wooden chest, she felt the same helpless fear that had haunted her many years before. Yet she also recognized something else. The little boy she had once held beneath stormy skies had become a man. She could no longer protect him from the world beyond Seriphos. Quietly embracing her son, she asked only one thing. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "do not lose the kindness that has always guided your heart." Perseus promised that he never would. Before sunrise the following morning, carrying only his father's invisible blessing and his mother's quiet prayers, he prepared to leave the peaceful island that had been his home since childhood. Far beyond the eastern horizon, hidden somewhere between myth and reality, destiny had already begun preparing the path that would lead him toward the terrifying gaze of Medusa herself. Before the first rays of sunlight touched the quiet waters surrounding Seriphos, Perseus stood alone upon the rocky shoreline, where he had spent almost his entire life. Behind him, the small white cottages of the island still slept peacefully beneath the fading stars. Fishing boats rested silently inside the harbour, gently rising and falling with the calm tide. While distant seabirds had not yet begun their morning calls, everything looked exactly as it always had, yet Perseus understood that nothing would ever be the same again. His childhood had ended the moment he accepted King Polydectes' impossible challenge. Somewhere beyond the endless horizon waited Medusa, the most feared creature in all of Greek mythology, and no map carried by ordinary sailors marked the road leading to her hidden home. He possessed no army, no royal treasury, and no magical weapon capable of defeating such a monster. All he carried was a simple bronze sword, a traveller's cloak, and the promise he had made before the assembled court. Danae embraced her son one final time before sunrise, struggling to hide the fear filling her heart. She had already watched one king try to destroy her family because of a prophecy, and now another ruler had sent her only son toward what appeared to be certain death. Yet unlike King Acrisius, Danae believed that destiny could not be escaped through fear alone. She gently placed her hands upon Perseus's shoulders, and reminded him of the lessons that had guided him since childhood. "Strength will carry you only so far," she whispered. "Let wisdom choose the path whenever courage alone is not enough." Perseus nodded quietly before turning toward the eastern hills. Without another word, he began walking away from the island home that had shaped every memory of his life, never once looking back, because he knew that if he did, leaving would become far more difficult than facing any monster waiting ahead. For many days, Perseus traveled across unfamiliar coastlines, passing through quiet fishing villages, rugged mountain paths, and peaceful valleys where shepherds watched over their flocks beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Unlike later heroes who often traveled with companions beside them, Perseus faced the unknown entirely alone. Every evening he rested beneath ancient olive trees or inside small temples dedicated to the gods, where travelers were traditionally welcomed with food, fresh water, and a safe place to sleep. Hospitality remained one of the most sacred customs in ancient Greece. A stranger arriving at one's door might unknowingly be a messenger from Olympus itself, and kindness shown to travelers was believed to honor Zeus, protector of guests. During these long days, Perseus repeatedly asked the same question wherever he stopped. Does anyone know where Medusa lives? The answers never brought comfort. Most people immediately crossed themselves or whispered prayers to the gods after hearing her name. Some warned him never to speak of the Gorgons aloud after sunset. Others laughed sadly, convinced no young traveler could survive such a journey. A few old sailors claimed they had heard distant stories placing the Gorgons somewhere beyond the western edge of the known world, while wandering merchants insisted they lived far south, across deserts where no ordinary Greek had ever traveled. Every answer differed, yet all agreed upon one thing: whoever searched for Medusa never returned. Still, Perseus continued walking. The farther he traveled from Seriphos, the more he realized that defeating Medusa would require something greater than determination. Before he could slay the monster, he first had to discover where she could even be found. High above the world of mortals, the Olympian gods had been watching the young hero from the moment he stepped away from the shores of Seriphos. Zeus, ruler of the heavens and father of Perseus, remained silent as he observed his son's quiet determination. Yet two other deities watched with particular interest. The first was Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and just warfare. Throughout Greek mythology, Athena rarely admired heroes who relied only upon brute strength. She favored those who combined courage with intelligence, patience, and careful judgment. Perseus possessed precisely those qualities. The second was Hermes, swift-footed messenger of the gods, guardian of travelers, merchants, and clever minds. Hermes had guided countless heroes before, delighting in wit and resourcefulness rather than reckless violence. Looking down upon Perseus wandering alone through unfamiliar lands, both gods recognized that without divine guidance, the young man would never reach Medusa alive. Ancient Greek myths frequently remind us that while heroes achieve greatness through their own choices, the gods often provide opportunities that no ordinary mortal could ever create alone. One peaceful afternoon, as Perseus rested beside a quiet spring hidden beneath towering cypress trees, two unfamiliar travelers approached along the narrow forest path. Their clothing appeared simple enough, and nothing about their appearance immediately revealed their divine nature. One carried a traveler's staff, while the other wore a plain grey cloak that concealed a bronze helmet beneath its folds. They greeted Perseus warmly before sitting beside the spring, as though they too had simply paused to escape the afternoon heat. After sharing bread and fresh water together, one of the strangers smiled gently before asking a simple question. "Young traveler, where does your road lead?" Perseus answered honestly, just as he always had. "I seek Medusa." Neither traveler laughed, neither warned him to abandon the impossible mission. Instead, the older of the two looked carefully into Perseus's eyes before asking another question. "And if you found her, how would you survive even a single glance?" Perseus remained silent. For the first time since leaving Seriphos, he admitted openly that he had no answer. He knew only that he had given his word and intended to keep it, even if doing so cost his life. The two strangers exchanged quiet glances before slowly rising to their feet. Suddenly, the peaceful forest changed. The afternoon sunlight seemed brighter. The gentle breeze fell completely still. A warm, golden light surrounded both travelers as their ordinary appearance disappeared, like mist beneath the morning sun. The plain cloak transformed into shining armor, decorated with the image of the owl. A magnificent bronze helmet rested upon noble features filled with calm wisdom. Beside her, the simple traveller's staff became the famous golden caduceus, entwined by two serpents, while winged sandals gleamed beneath the feet of the smiling companion. Perseus immediately fell to one knee. Before him now stood Athena and Hermes themselves. Although ancient Greek heroes often encountered the gods, such meetings were never ordinary moments. Mortals understood. They stood in the presence of beings whose power stretched far beyond human imagination. Yet, neither deity demanded worship. Athena simply spoke with the quiet confidence for which she was always known. "Rise, Perseus. Your courage has brought you this far. Now wisdom must guide the rest of your journey." Hermes explained that finding Medusa would prove impossible without first discovering three mysterious beings, known as the Graeae, ancient sisters older than memory itself, who alone knew the hidden path leading toward the Gorgons. Athena carefully warned Perseus that the Graeae possessed strange appearances unlike any ordinary women. They had been born already old, their wrinkled faces marked by countless centuries, and together they shared only one eye and one tooth, passing both between themselves whenever one wished to see or speak clearly, because they alone knew the location of Medusa. Perseus would need to outwit them rather than fight them. Hermes then smiled with quiet amusement, clearly enjoying the cleverness of the plan. When they passed their single eye from one sister to another, he advised, "Take it before either can use it. They will have no choice but to bargain with you." Perseus listened carefully, committing every word to memory. Athena then lifted her shining shield. Unlike ordinary bronze shields polished for battle, its surface reflected everything before it with perfect clarity. Smooth as still water beneath a cloudless sky. "When the time comes to face Medusa," she said softly, "never look directly into her eyes. Watch only her reflection." Perseus understood immediately. The monster's terrible curse worked through direct sight. A reflection might allow him to see without ever meeting her deadly gaze. Already the impossible task seemed just slightly more achievable. Before disappearing once more, Hermes placed a reassuring hand upon Perseus's shoulder. "The road ahead will remain dangerous," he said. "But remember this, the greatest heroes are remembered not because they never feared danger, but because they continued walking even while fear traveled beside them." With those final words, both gods slowly vanished into the golden afternoon light, leaving the forest exactly as it had been before. Only the memory of their voices remained upon the quiet air. Perseus stood alone once again beside the peaceful spring, yet he no longer felt lost. For the first time since leaving Seriphos, he possessed not merely hope, but a clear direction. Somewhere beyond distant mountains, hidden at the edge of the ancient world, lived the mysterious Graeae, guardians of the secret, leading to Medusa herself. The greatest hunt in Greek mythology had truly begun. For many weeks, Perseus continued his lonely journey across the ancient world, following only the guidance given to him by Athena and Hermes. Each sunrise carried him farther beyond the familiar lands known to ordinary Greek travelers and deeper into regions that existed somewhere between geography and legend. The comfortable villages of the Aegean gradually disappeared behind him, replaced by wild landscapes where towering mountains cast enormous shadows across silent valleys untouched by farming or trade. Narrow rivers rushed down steep cliffs before vanishing into dark forests, where ancient trees had stood since long before the first kings ruled Greece. Some nights Perseus slept beneath clear skies, overflowing with countless stars, while on others he found shelter inside abandoned temples, whose weathered columns still honoured forgotten gods worshipped by generations now long gone. Travelling alone taught him patience more than speed. There was no one with whom to share the long miles, no companion to lift his spirits when exhaustion settled heavily upon his shoulders. Yet each evening, before closing his eyes beneath the stars, he remembered the promise made before King Polydectes and the quiet embrace of his mother upon the shores of Seriphos. Turning back never truly entered his thoughts. The farther he travelled, the more he realised that every legendary hero before him must have faced moments of loneliness, where only determination remained to guide the next step forward. Great adventures are rarely filled only with glorious battles. Much of every heroic journey consists simply of continuing to walk when no certainty of success exists. As Perseus moved farther north, the landscape slowly transformed into something far stranger than anything he had previously imagined. The air grew noticeably colder despite the bright summer sun, while a pale grey mist drifted endlessly between jagged cliffs rising high above the surrounding valleys. Even the wildlife seemed unusually quiet. Birds that had accompanied him throughout much of his journey no longer sang among the trees. The steady sound of insects disappeared completely. Only the distant whisper of the wind echoed through the rocky wilderness ahead. Ancient travelers often believed certain places existed, beyond the ordinary reach of human civilization, regions where strange beings older than mankind still lingered in forgotten corners of the earth. According to Hermes, somewhere within this desolate landscape lived the mysterious Graeae, sisters so ancient that even the Olympian gods spoke of them with quiet respect. Unlike monsters driven by violence alone, the Graeae represented something even older than fear itself. They belonged to an age when the world had only recently separated from chaos, carrying within them knowledge passed down since the earliest days of creation. Every path Perseus followed seemed gradually leading toward that forgotten time. The deeper he entered the mist-covered hills, the heavier the silence became, until even his own footsteps sounded strangely distant against the weathered stone beneath his sandals. Late one afternoon, while carefully climbing a narrow mountain path, Perseus finally noticed movement ahead. At first, he believed 3 elderly women were sitting beside an ancient rock, speaking softly among themselves. Yet, as he quietly moved closer, he realized there was something deeply unusual about them. Their skin appeared pale as weathered marble, marked by countless wrinkles that suggested unimaginable age. Long grey hair drifted gently in the cold breeze, while thin hands rested quietly upon wooden staffs polished smooth through centuries of use. None of them seemed capable of seeing. One sister held a single, cloudy eye carefully between her fingers, before slowly placing it into the waiting hand of another. Only after the second sister carefully positioned the eye within her empty socket did she begin looking around the rocky valley. Moments later, she removed it once again, passing it to the third. Hermes had spoken the truth. The Graeae possessed only one eye shared between all 3. Nearby rested a single worn tooth, which they likewise exchanged whenever one wished to eat or speak more clearly. Watching from behind a cluster of dark stones, Perseus understood that he had finally reached the guardians of the secret leading toward Medusa. Yet he also recognized that confronting them openly would accomplish nothing. These mysterious sisters had survived countless generations before his birth. They would never surrender their knowledge willingly. Wisdom, not strength, would decide what happened next. Remaining perfectly hidden, Perseus patiently observed the strange routine repeated by the sisters. One received the eye, carefully examined the surrounding landscape for several moments, then removed it and handed it to the next. They moved slowly, speaking with ancient voices that carried the weariness of centuries. Although they appeared fragile, Perseus sensed immediately that underestimating them would be a serious mistake. Ancient beings often possessed powers that ordinary appearances concealed. Remembering Hermes' advice exactly, he waited for the brief instant when the eye rested in neither sister's possession. At last, the moment arrived. The first Graeae stretched out her trembling hand, while the second released the precious eye into the empty air between them. Before the third sister could catch it, Perseus burst from his hiding place with astonishing speed. In one smooth movement, he seized the single eye before any of the sisters realized what had happened. Their shocked cries echoed across the lonely valley as all 3 reached desperately toward the empty space where the eye should have been. For the first time in countless centuries, the Graeae found themselves completely blind together. Confusion immediately spread among them. They reached blindly for one another, calling out in frightened voices, while Perseus stepped quietly beyond their grasp, holding the eye safely within his hand. He felt no pleasure in frightening the elderly sisters, but he understood that without this single bold action, his journey would end before ever reaching the Gorgons. "Who has taken our eye?" one sister demanded angrily, her voice echoing across the cliffs. "Return it immediately," Perseus answered calmly, rather than mockingly. "I seek only one thing. Tell me where Medusa lives, and your eye will be returned unharmed." At the mention of Medusa's name, the sisters fell silent. For several long moments only the wind moved through the valley. Finally, the eldest sister spoke, her ancient voice carrying both irritation and reluctant admiration. "Few mortals have ever found us," she admitted. "Fewer still have managed to outwit us." Perseus remained patient, refusing to interrupt. The Graeae understood perfectly that without their shared eye, they would remain helpless forever. Yet, surrendering the secret of the Gorgons meant revealing knowledge entrusted to them since the earliest age of the world. Slowly, almost unwillingly, they began speaking. They described a distant land lying far beyond the ordinary limits of human travel, where the sun itself seemed reluctant to shine. There, surrounded by barren cliffs and silent valleys untouched by birds or animals, stood the hidden dwelling of the three Gorgon sisters. Two of them, Stheno and Uriel, possessed immortal life granted by the gods. Only the youngest, Medusa, remained mortal and therefore capable of being killed. The sisters then revealed another secret unknown to almost every living person. Before Perseus could reach the Gorgons, he must first seek the hidden nymphs of the north, guardians of three sacred treasures created by the gods themselves. Without those gifts, confronting Medusa would be hopeless. Only after hearing every detail did Perseus gently return the precious eye to the outstretched hands of the Graeae. They quickly passed it from one sister to another until all three could once again see the world before them. None attempted revenge. Instead, the eldest regarded Perseus thoughtfully, almost with quiet respect. "Go then, son of Zeus," she whispered. "Your courage has earned the knowledge you sought. Whether it will also earn your life, only the fates can answer." Following the directions given by the Graeae, Perseus continued traveling deeper into lands where few mortals had ever walked. The mountains grew higher, snow appeared upon distant peaks despite the warmth of the season. Crystal streams flowed through valleys carpeted with brilliant wildflowers, unlike any growing in Greece. Everywhere the landscape seemed strangely untouched by ordinary human life, as though the gods themselves still wandered these peaceful places when no one watched. After many more days of travel, Perseus finally reached a quiet grove hidden beneath towering silver trees whose leaves shimmered softly even without sunlight. The air carried the sweet fragrance of flowers blooming beside clear pools of water, so perfectly still that they reflected the sky like polished glass. Here lived the mysterious nymphs spoken of by the Graeae, immortal guardians, chosen to protect divine gifts until the proper hero arrived to claim them. As Perseus stepped carefully into the sacred grove, three graceful figures slowly emerged from among the trees, smiling gently as though they had been expecting his arrival long before he himself knew where the journey would lead. The final preparations for facing Medusa were about to begin, and the greatest gifts ever given to a Greek hero still waited just beyond the quiet waters of the enchanted grove. As Perseus stepped quietly into the sacred grove, the world around him seemed to change in ways that were difficult even to describe. The cold mountain winds that had followed him for so many days disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a gentle breeze carrying the fragrance of wild flowers and fresh spring water. Tall silver trees surrounded the peaceful valley, their leaves shimmering softly, although no sunlight passed through the thick canopy above. Crystal clear streams flowed silently between smooth white stones, while delicate birds with brilliant golden feathers flew gracefully from branch to branch without the slightest fear of the young traveller standing among them. Unlike every forest Perseus had crossed during his long journey, this place felt untouched by time itself. No axe had ever cut its ancient trees, no shepherd had ever led sheep across its meadows. Even the air carried an extraordinary stillness that reminded Perseus he had entered a place belonging more to the gods than to ordinary mortals. Ancient Greek storytellers often imagined such hidden sanctuaries existing far beyond the limits of human kingdoms, places where immortal beings quietly lived while the centuries passed unnoticed around them. Standing beside the peaceful stream, Perseus lowered his head respectfully, sensing that he had finally reached the destination foretold by the Graeae. He had not travelled here to seek wealth or glory. He had come because without the blessings guarded within this enchanted valley, no hero, however brave, could hope to survive a single encounter with Medusa. Before long, the stillness was gently broken by the sound of soft footsteps moving across the grass. From between the shining trees emerged three graceful figures whose beauty seemed almost impossible to describe. Their long robes flowed as lightly as drifting mist, while delicate wreaths of flowers rested upon their hair. Unlike the powerful Olympian gods whose presence often filled mortals with overwhelming awe, these immortal beings carried a gentler kind of majesty. They were the Nymphs, ancient guardians of rivers, forests, springs, and hidden places, where nature itself remained pure and undisturbed. Their expressions held neither surprise nor suspicion. Instead, they smiled warmly, as though Perseus had been expected long before he ever began his journey from Seriphos. The eldest stepped forward first, studying the young hero quietly before speaking. "The Graeae have sent you," she said in a calm voice that seemed almost as peaceful as the flowing stream beside her. Perseus nodded respectfully. "I seek only the means to complete the task given to me," he replied. "Without your help, I cannot reach Medusa." The nymphs exchanged gentle glances before leading him deeper into the grove, where a small stone altar rested beneath an enormous silver tree older than memory itself. Upon the altar lay 3 objects carefully wrapped in white cloth, preserved through countless generations for the day they would finally be needed. Ancient myths often tell us that destiny prepares its greatest gifts long before the hero arrives to receive them, and Perseus now stood before treasures that had waited centuries for his hands alone. The first gift was a pair of magnificent winged sandals, said to have been crafted for Hermes himself. Their leather straps appeared surprisingly simple, yet delicate golden wings extended gracefully from either side, shining softly beneath the filtered light falling through the ancient branches overhead. The eldest nymph carefully lifted them from the altar before kneeling to fasten them securely around Perseus's ankles. The moment the straps were tightened, the young hero felt something extraordinary flow through his body. His feet suddenly seemed almost weightless, as though the earth itself had loosened its hold upon him. Curious, Perseus cautiously stepped forward. Instead of walking normally, he found himself rising gently above the grass before quickly descending once again. The nymphs smiled quietly at his astonishment. "These sandals," one explained, "will carry you across mountains, seas, and skies, faster than the strongest wind. No ordinary road will limit your journey again." Perseus looked upward toward the endless sky stretching above the sacred grove, realizing that for the first time in history, a mortal hero would travel not only across the earth, but through the heavens themselves. Yet even such an extraordinary gift alone would never be enough. Medusa's gaze remained as deadly in the sky as upon the ground. The second treasure appeared far less remarkable at first glance. It was a beautifully woven leather pouch known as the kibisis, large enough to carry something valuable, yet strangely light despite its elegant craftsmanship. One of the younger nymphs placed it gently into Perseus's hands before explaining its true purpose. "When Medusa falls," she said quietly, "her head will remain just as dangerous as when she lived. Even in death, her eyes will retain the power to turn living creatures into stone. No ordinary bag can safely contain such a thing. Only this sacred pouch has been blessed to carry it without releasing its terrible curse." Perseus carefully examined the remarkable gift. It seemed impossible that something so ordinary in appearance could conceal one of the most dangerous objects ever known. Yet ancient Greek mythology often reminds us that true power rarely announces itself through outward appearance. Wisdom hides where pride expects nothing. Perseus thanked the nymph sincerely before placing the kibisis securely across his shoulder. Already he understood that every gift received from the gods possessed a purpose, carefully chosen long before his arrival. Finally, the eldest nymph returned to the altar and lifted the third and final object. At first, Perseus thought it to be only an old bronze helmet darkened by age. Yet, as she held it beneath the light filtering through the trees, strange patterns shimmered across its surface before disappearing once more. "This," she whispered with obvious reverence, "is the helm of Hades, lord of the underworld." Even speaking its name seemed to fill the quiet grove with deeper silence. According to the oldest Greek traditions, the helmet possessed extraordinary power. Whoever wore it became completely invisible, hidden not only from human eyes, but even from many immortal beings themselves. During the Great War between the Olympian gods and the Titans, Hades himself had worn this enchanted helm while fighting unseen across the battlefield. Now, for only a brief time, it would pass into the hands of Perseus. Carefully placing the helmet upon his head, the young hero immediately vanished. Looking downward in surprise, he could no longer see his own hands or body. Even the nymphs smiled as though speaking to empty air. Removing the helm once more, Perseus slowly reappeared beneath the ancient trees. The eldest guardian looked at him kindly. "Remember," she warned, "this helmet may hide your body, but it cannot hide foolish decisions. Even invisible men may still choose the wrong path." Perseus bowed respectfully, recognizing the wisdom hidden within her simple words. As though the gods themselves had been waiting for this moment, a warm golden light suddenly spread across the grove once more. Hermes appeared again beside the quiet stream, his winged sandals barely touching the earth, while Athena stood silently nearby, holding the brilliant shield she had shown Perseus during their earlier meeting. Without speaking, the goddess carefully handed him the polished bronze shield. Its surface reflected the surrounding forest with perfect clarity, smoother than still water beneath a summer sky. "Never meet Medusa's eyes directly," Athena reminded him. "Let this shield become your sight. Trust the reflection more than your own vision." Hermes then drew from beneath his traveling cloak a magnificent curved sword forged from adamant, a metal so strong that no earthly weapon could match its edge. Placing it firmly into Perseus's hands, he smiled with quiet confidence. "This blade has been tempered to cut what ordinary bronze cannot. Guard it well, for the opportunity to strike Medusa will come only once." Perseus now stood equipped with everything the gods believed necessary: winged sandals to reach the impossible, the helm of Hades to escape unseen, the sacred Pegasus to carry the terrible prize, Athena's shining shield to avoid the fatal gaze, Hermes' divine sword to deliver the final blow. Yet, despite all these miraculous gifts, the greatest challenge still lay ahead. No weapon could remove fear from a hero's heart. That battle belonged to Perseus alone. Before departing, Athena looked toward the distant western horizon, where the evening sun slowly descended beyond lands no ordinary Greek had ever explored. "Beyond the edge of the known world," she said softly, "where even the birds hesitate to fly, lies the lonely valley of the Gorgons. There dwell three sisters. Stheno and Euryale cannot die. Only Medusa remains mortal. Do not seek glory through battle. Seek only the single moment when wisdom overcomes danger." Hermes smiled once more before adding, "And remember, returning home is often harder than reaching the destination." With those final words, both gods slowly disappeared, leaving Perseus standing alone beneath the silver trees. Fastening the winged sandals securely around his ankles, he took one slow breath before stepping lightly into the air. Instead of falling back toward the earth, he continued rising higher and higher until the sacred grove became only a tiny patch of green far below. Mountains passed beneath him. Rivers shone like silver threads winding through endless forests. The entire world slowly unfolded below his feet as he flew westward toward the place where no ordinary traveler dared to go. Somewhere beyond the last light of the setting sun waited Medusa, the only mortal among the terrible Gorgons, and the moment that would determine whether Perseus became another forgotten traveler, or one of the greatest heroes the ancient world would ever remember. As Perseus soared westward through the endless sky upon the winged sandals given to him by the immortal nymphs, the familiar world of Greece slowly disappeared beneath distant clouds. Far below, the blue waters of the Mediterranean stretched toward every horizon, broken only by scattered islands that looked no larger than tiny stones resting upon a sheet of polished glass. Hours passed peacefully, as the young hero flew beyond the lands marked on ordinary maps, leaving behind every kingdom, harbour, and village known to human travellers. The farther he journeyed, the stranger the world became. The warm sunlight that had accompanied him throughout much of the day gradually faded behind heavy grey clouds drifting across the western sky. Gentle sea breezes gave way to colder winds carrying the scent of distant mountains and lonely wilderness. Even the birds that had occasionally flown beneath him during the early hours of his flight slowly disappeared. It was almost as though nature itself refused to travel any farther. Ancient Greek sailors often believed there existed places beyond the edge of the familiar world, where ordinary life simply stopped, regions so ancient that even the gods rarely spoke of them. Perseus now approached one of those forgotten lands. Every mile carried him closer to Medusa, and with every passing moment he felt an unusual mixture of excitement, determination, and quiet fear growing within his heart. Courage, he had learned long ago, was never the absence of fear. True courage meant continuing forward, even while fear remained your closest companion. By late afternoon, the sea beneath him slowly gave way to an enormous stretch of barren coastline, unlike anything Perseus had ever seen before. There were no fishing villages nestled beside quiet harbours, no merchant ships sailed along the shore, no shepherds guided flocks across green hills. Instead, towering black cliffs rose directly from the crashing waves, their jagged peaks disappearing into thick curtains of drifting mist. Great cracks split the ancient rock as though earthquakes had torn the landscape apart countless ages ago. Narrow valleys wound silently between the cliffs before vanishing into darkness so complete that even sunlight seemed unable to enter. Every colour appeared strangely muted. The bright greens of Greece had disappeared, replaced by endless shades of grey, black, and pale silver. The sea itself had changed. Its waters no longer sparkled beneath the afternoon sun, but rolled heavily against the shore with slow, deliberate waves that echoed endlessly through the empty cliffs. Perseus circled high above the coastline, searching for any sign of life. There was none. No smoke rose from hidden settlements, no animals moved across the rocks. Even the wind sounded different here, carrying long, mournful whispers through the valleys, as though countless forgotten voices still lingered among the stone. Looking down from the sky, Perseus understood immediately why so few travellers ever returned from this place. Long before anyone encountered Medusa herself, the land surrounding her home seemed designed to rob visitors of hope. As the winged sandals gently carried him farther inland, Perseus noticed something unusual scattered across the desolate landscape below. At first, he mistook them for ordinary stone pillars rising from the rocky ground, yet the closer he flew, the more clearly their shapes emerged. They were not pillars at all, they were statues, hundreds of them. Some stood proudly upon the cliffs overlooking the sea. Others knelt with shields raised before their faces. A few lay broken across the valley floor, half buried beneath centuries of wind-blown dust. Curious, Perseus slowly descended until his feet touched the cold earth beside one of the nearest figures. The moment he stood before it, a deep sadness settled quietly over him. The statue did not resemble an artist's carefully carved sculpture. Every fold of clothing, every strand of hair, every expression upon the face appeared astonishingly lifelike. The young warrior's eyes remained wide open in terror, his mouth frozen halfway through what had almost certainly been his final cry. One hand still gripped a bronze sword, while the other reached desperately toward the empty air before him. Perseus gently brushed centuries of dust from the stone figure's shoulder before stepping back in silence. This had once been a living man. Somewhere far from home, he too had dreamed of defeating Medusa. Now he remained here forever, transformed into lifeless stone by a single careless glance. Perseus slowly looked across the valley. Suddenly, the truth became impossible to ignore. Every statue surrounding him represented another failed hero. Some wore armor unlike anything found in Greece, suggesting they had traveled from distant kingdoms far beyond the Aegean. Others appeared much older, their weathered surfaces slowly crumbling after countless centuries beneath the wind and rain. Yet despite their differences, all shared the same expression: surprise. Fear, regret. None had expected death to arrive so quickly. For a long time, Perseus wandered quietly among the silent stone figures. There was no battle to witness now, no cries of pain, no clash of bronze against bronze. Only silence remained. In many ways, the valley itself had become a vast cemetery where no names marked the graves. He stopped beside an elderly traveller whose walking staff still rested firmly within his petrified hands. Nearby stood what appeared to have been a king, wearing an elaborate crown carved forever from solid stone. A little farther away lay the broken remains of horses, hunting dogs, and even enormous wild beasts that had somehow wandered too close to the terrible gaze of the Gorgon. Ancient myths often describe Medusa simply as a monster, whose eyes turned people into stone. But standing among these silent figures revealed something much deeper. Every statue represented a dream interrupted. Every face told the story of someone who had believed, even for a brief moment, that they might succeed where everyone else had failed. Perseus found himself wondering about their names. Did they also have mothers waiting for them to return home? Had they promised friends they would come back victorious? Had they once looked toward the same distant horizon filled with confidence before taking one fatal step too close? Such thoughts lingered heavily within his mind. He realized that greatness in Greek mythology was often built not only upon the victories of heroes, but also upon the forgotten failures of countless others whose stories had slowly disappeared with time. As evening approached, the valley grew even quieter. Thick mist drifted lazily across the rocky ground, slowly wrapping itself around the countless statues until they appeared almost like silent ghosts emerging from another age. Perseus chose a sheltered place beneath an enormous weathered cliff, where he could safely rest before continuing farther into Medusa's domain the following morning. Although the winged sandals had carried him effortlessly across half the world, the journey itself had been long, and both mind and body needed a few hours of peace. Sitting beside a cold spring flowing gently from the rocks, he carefully removed Athena's polished shield from his back and examined its flawless reflective surface once again. He remembered every word spoken by the goddess. Never look directly at Medusa. Trust only the reflection. Such simple advice seemed almost impossible to follow in the middle of battle. Every instinct told a warrior to watch his enemy with his own eyes. Yet here, surrounded by hundreds of stone reminders of what happened when instinct overcame wisdom, Perseus understood why Athena had spoken so firmly. Before sleeping, he quietly sharpened Hermes' divine sword until its edge gleamed faintly beneath the fading light. Then he carefully placed the helm of Hades beside him, the Pegasus within easy reach, and the polished shield resting across his knees. Everything he would soon need lay ready before him. The only thing remaining was courage. Far away, hidden somewhere beyond the mist-covered cliffs, something stirred within the darkness. A faint hissing sound drifted gently across the valley. It came once, then again. Not the hiss of a single serpent, but of dozens, perhaps hundreds. Perseus slowly opened his eyes. Without making the slightest sound, he reached for Athena's shield. Tomorrow, he would finally come face to face with Medusa. Morning arrived slowly over the forgotten valley, although the word morning hardly seemed appropriate in a place where sunlight struggled to reach the earth. Thick grey mist still covered much of the rocky landscape, drifting silently between towering cliffs, whose jagged peaks disappeared into low clouds overhead. Unlike the bright dawns Perseus remembered from Seriphos, where golden light reflected gently across the calm waters of the Aegean Sea, this land greeted each new day with cold silence and heavy shadows. Even the air felt strangely still, carrying none of the familiar sounds that usually welcomed sunrise. There were no singing birds hidden among the trees, because no trees grew here, no distant shepherd called to his flock. No insects buzzed softly among wildflowers. Nature itself seemed to have abandoned this lonely place long ago. Perseus slowly rose from where he had rested beneath the shelter of the great cliff, taking a long moment simply to observe the world around him. Hundreds of stone figures still stood scattered across the valley exactly as they had the evening before, frozen forever in the final moments of their lives. During the night, a thin layer of dew had settled across their weathered faces, making them appear almost alive beneath the pale light filtering through the mist. Looking upon them once more, Perseus silently promised himself that he would not become another forgotten statue, standing among these silent witnesses to failure. Carefully fastening the winged sandals around his ankles, securing the Pegasus across his shoulder, and placing the helm of Hades within easy reach, he lifted Athena's polished shield before him. From this moment onward, every step required absolute discipline. One careless glance would end everything. As Perseus ventured deeper into the valley, the landscape grew increasingly unsettling. The narrow path twisted between enormous black rocks, whose strange shapes often resembled crouching beasts waiting patiently within the fog. More statues appeared with every passing minute. Some stood only a few years old, their clothing still sharply detailed despite having become stone. Others had weathered beneath centuries of wind and rain, until moss and pale lichen covered much of their once human forms. Perseus paused beside one particularly remarkable figure. Unlike the frightened warriors surrounding it, this statue belonged to a woman carrying nothing except a small basket filled with herbs. Her peaceful expression suggested she had not come seeking glory or battle. Perhaps she had been a healer, searching for rare plants believed to grow within the Forbidden Valley. Nearby stood what looked like an elderly scholar, holding a rolled scroll tightly against his chest. A little farther ahead rested the stone remains of several hunting dogs. forever frozen mid-stride, their loyal eyes fixed upon a danger they could no longer escape. The valley held not only ambitious heroes but ordinary travelers, curious explorers, wandering priests, merchants who had lost their way, and countless others whose names had vanished from history. Greek mythology rarely tells their stories, yet their silent presence reminded Perseus that every legendary place leaves behind far more forgotten lives than famous ones. Victory belonged to only a handful. Failure belongs to almost everyone else. The farther he travelled, the more unusual the surroundings became. Strange rock formations rose from the valley floor in enormous twisting shapes, unlike anything found elsewhere in Greece. Some resembled giant serpents coiled around one another, while others looked almost like enormous hands reaching upward from beneath the earth. Deep cracks split the ground, releasing thin streams of pale vapor that drifted slowly across the rocks before disappearing into the cold morning air. The smell of damp stone mixed with an unfamiliar scent, faintly metallic, almost as though the valley itself carried the memory of countless battles fought long ago. Perseus continued moving carefully, never allowing his eyes to wander too far from the flawless reflection shining within Athena's shield. Every few steps he reminded himself not to look directly ahead. It felt unnatural. Every instinct urged him to lift his head and observe the world normally, yet he forced himself to trust the goddess completely. Gradually he became accustomed to navigating through reflections rather than direct sight. The polished bronze showed every movement before him with astonishing clarity. Rocks, statues, cliffs, and drifting mist all appeared perfectly upon its smooth surface. Athena had not merely given him a shield, she had given him another way of seeing the world. Hours passed in almost complete silence before Perseus noticed the first unmistakable sign that Medusa was close. It began with a sound so soft, he almost believed he had imagined it. Somewhere beyond the mist came the gentle scrape of scales, moving slowly across stone, then another, then several more. Unlike the rustling of ordinary snakes hidden among dry grass, these sounds carried remarkable weight, as though many large serpents slithered together across the rocky ground. Perseus stopped immediately. Holding his breath, he listened carefully. The valley fell silent once more. Only the faint whisper of the wind drifted between the cliffs. After waiting several long moments, he cautiously resumed walking. The sounds returned almost instantly. This time, they seemed slightly nearer. A quiet chorus of soft hissing echoed through the fog, rising and falling without any obvious direction. Ancient storytellers often described Medusa's hair as living snakes, each one moving independently, each producing its own endless hiss. Perseus realized he was no longer merely approaching the Gorgon's territory. He had entered it. Every instinct within him screamed to turn around, to flee, while escape remained possible. Yet another voice, quieter but far stronger, reminded him of Danae waiting patiently upon Seriphos, of King Polydectes' cruel deception, and of every difficult step that had already brought him this far. Fear remained beside him, but it no longer controlled him. Eventually, the narrow valley opened into an enormous rocky basin, surrounded by towering cliffs on every side. Thick mist drifted lazily across the ground, never rising higher than Perseus's knees. At the center of the basin stood the ruins of what had once been an ancient temple built long before recorded history. Broken columns lay scattered across the cracked stone floor, while weathered statues of forgotten gods leaned dangerously beneath centuries of neglect. Massive vines covered much of the remaining structure, their twisted roots slowly pulling ancient walls apart stone by stone. It seemed impossible that such a beautiful sanctuary had become the home of one of mythology's most feared monsters. Yet Perseus remembered another old story told by Greek priests during his childhood. Long before becoming the terrifying Gorgon, Medusa herself had once served as a beautiful maiden within the sacred temple of Athena. Different ancient authors preserved different versions of what happened next. Some blamed Poseidon, others blamed Medusa, still others suggested the truth had been lost long before anyone began writing these stories down. Whatever the original events may have been, Athena's anger transformed the young woman forever. Her beautiful hair became living serpents. Her graceful face became so terrible that anyone meeting her gaze instantly turned to stone. Thus, one of the most tragic figures in Greek mythology was born, not as a monster from the beginning, but as someone whose life had been changed forever by the decisions of gods more powerful than herself. Standing before the silent ruins, Perseus found himself wondering whether any trace of the woman Medusa had once been still remained beneath the terrifying curse. A cold breeze suddenly swept through the ruined temple. The mist began moving, slowly at first, then faster. The soft hissing grew louder than ever before. 1 snake, 10 snakes, 100 snakes. The sound seemed to surround the entire basin. Perseus immediately lowered his eyes toward Athena's shield. Within its polished reflection, he saw movement. A dark figure slowly emerged from between the shattered columns. She walked with calm, deliberate steps. Long serpents writhed endlessly where ordinary hair should have rested. Their scales glistened softly beneath the pale morning light. Her bronze claws scraped gently across the ancient stone. Immense golden wings folded quietly behind her back. She had not yet noticed him. Perseus tightened his grip around Hermes' divine sword. The moment every hero before him had feared had finally arrived. Perseus remained perfectly motionless behind the shattered column, every breath slow and carefully measured as the soft hissing of countless serpents drifted through the ruined temple. He resisted every instinct urging him to lift his head. Instead, he fixed his entire attention upon the flawless reflection shining within Athena's polished bronze shield. The surface reflected the ancient courtyard with astonishing clarity. Broken columns stood like forgotten guardians around the crumbling sanctuary. Patches of grey mist drifted lazily across the cracked stone floor, and there, slowly emerging from between the ruined pillars, came the figure whose name had filled Greece with fear for generations. Through the reflection alone, Perseus saw Medusa for the very first time. She moved with surprising grace rather than monstrous violence, each careful step almost silent despite the sharp bronze claws extending from her hands. Great wings rested folded behind her back, their dark feathers shifting gently whenever the cold breeze crossed the valley. Around her head, dozens of living serpents twisted endlessly together, their scales catching the faint morning light, while hundreds of tiny golden eyes searched every corner of the ruined sanctuary. Their endless hissing blended into one continuous whisper that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Perseus understood immediately why so many heroes had failed. The true danger of Medusa was not merely her deadly gaze. It was the overwhelming fear created simply by standing in her presence. Every part of his body urged him to flee before she even noticed he existed. Yet beneath that fear remained something stronger. He remembered Danae standing beside the sea when he left Seriphos. He remembered the quiet wisdom of Athena, the encouragement of Hermes, and the peaceful grove where the immortal Nymphs had entrusted him with gifts prepared long before his birth. None of those sacrifices could end here. Tightening his grip upon Hermes' divine sword, Perseus waited patiently for the single opportunity that might never come again. Medusa herself appeared strangely unaware that another living soul had entered her lonely kingdom. She wandered slowly through the ancient ruins, as though following the same familiar path she had walked countless times before. Watching only her reflection, Perseus noticed something unexpected. The terrifying monster, described in every Greek legend, carried an unmistakable sadness within her movements. She did not stalk the valley, searching for victims. She simply existed there, trapped inside endless solitude. Ancient myths preserved many different versions of Medusa's story, yet almost all agreed upon one painful truth. She had not always been the creature standing before him now. Once she had been admired for extraordinary beauty, serving within the sacred temple of Athena before divine anger transformed her forever. Whether the blame belonged to Poseidon, Athena, fate, or the changing traditions of countless storytellers, no one could truly say. Over centuries, the details shifted from one poet to another. Yet standing within the ruined sanctuary, Perseus found it impossible to ignore the quiet tragedy before him. The valley surrounding Medusa contained no companions, no laughter, no ordinary life, only endless silence broken by the restless movement of living serpents. Every traveler who wandered too close became another statue. Every attempt at human contact ended in death. The curse had not merely turned Medusa into a monster, it had condemned her to unimaginable loneliness stretching across years beyond counting. For one brief moment, Perseus wondered whether she herself longed for the curse to end. Such thoughts filled him with compassion, yet they could not change what needed to happen. If he hesitated, he too would become another silent figure, standing forever among the countless statues filling the valley. Slowly, Medusa approached the center of the ruined temple, where the cracked remains of an ancient altar still stood beneath the open sky. One by one, the snakes upon her head lifted themselves higher, tasting the cold air with flickering tongues, as though sensing something unfamiliar carried by the wind. Perseus froze completely. Even the smallest movement now might betray his presence. Remembering the helm of Hades resting securely upon his head, he silently thanked the gods for the invisible protection surrounding him. Although Medusa's terrible eyes could turn any living creature into stone, they could not find what they could not see. She paused only a short distance away, listening carefully. The valley became so quiet that Perseus could hear the slow beating of his own heart. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity. One serpent suddenly turned toward the exact place where he stood, hidden behind the fallen column. Another followed, then another. Their hissing grew louder, more urgent. Perseus realized that while the helm concealed his body from sight, it could not erase his scent, nor completely silence the faint rhythm of his breathing. Medusa slowly raised her head. Her terrible golden eyes searched the empty air before her. Had Perseus looked directly into them, the journey would have ended at that very instant. Instead, he lowered his gaze even further toward Athena's shield, trusting its reflection completely. Time itself seemed to stop. The snakes continued watching the empty space where the invisible hero waited. Yet, after several long moments, Medusa relaxed once again. Whatever had disturbed her seemed to disappear as quickly as it had arrived. Turning gracefully away, she continued walking toward the far side of the sanctuary. Perseus knew this was the only opportunity he would ever receive. Every lesson Chiron had once taught heroes, every word spoken by Athena, every mile traveled across the ancient world, every gift placed into his hands by gods and immortal guardians had led to this single moment. Moving with extraordinary care, he stepped silently from behind the broken column. Never once did he lift his eyes from the shining reflection upon the bronze shield. Medusa remained only a few steps ahead, completely unaware that destiny itself had quietly approached from behind. Perseus slowly raised Hermes' divine sword. The blade seemed almost weightless in his hands, its polished edge glowing faintly beneath the pale morning light filtering through drifting clouds. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied. The world around him faded into silence, until nothing remained except the reflection before him. One more step, then another. The snakes continued whispering softly among themselves. Medusa stood perfectly still. Gathering every ounce of courage within his heart, Perseus swung the divine sword in one swift, powerful movement, guided entirely by Athena's reflection rather than his own eyes. The enchanted blade passed cleanly through Medusa's neck with astonishing precision. For one single heartbeat, the valley fell completely silent. Then, the ancient curse finally came to its end. Medusa's body collapsed gently upon the weathered stones, while the terrible hissing suddenly ceased. At that very instant, a brilliant flash of golden light burst from the place where she had fallen. From her immortal blood sprang two extraordinary beings long hidden within the mystery of Greek legend. The first was the magnificent winged horse Pegasus, whose dazzling white wings spread across the ruined sanctuary before carrying him high into the brightening sky. Beside him emerged Chrysaor, a mysterious warrior whose name meant "He of the Golden Sword." Ancient poets later offered many interpretations of these miraculous births, yet all agreed that they symbolized new life emerging from the ending of an ancient curse. Perseus watched only briefly before remembering the final task still awaiting him. Without hesitation, he carefully placed Medusa's head inside the sacred cubicis, sealing the magical pouch exactly as the nymphs had instructed. Even in death, the Gorgon's eyes retained their terrible power. Yet the moment the sacred head disappeared inside the enchanted pouch, a thunderous cry echoed across the valley. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the force of the sound. Perseus immediately recognized its source. Medusa had not lived alone. Her immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, had awakened. Unlike Medusa, they could never die. Their furious voices rolled across the black cliffs like distant storms, while enormous wings beat violently against the cold air. Through Athena's shield, Perseus caught his first glimpse of the two immortal Gorgons rushing toward the ruined temple, their monstrous forms far larger and even more terrifying than their fallen sister. Their screams carried unbearable grief, mixed with unimaginable rage. They searched wildly in every direction for the unseen killer responsible for Medusa's death, tearing apart broken columns with frightening strength while the valley echoed beneath their cries. Perseus knew he could not defeat immortal beings. Victory now depended entirely upon escape. Quickly placing the helm of Hades firmly upon his head once more, he became invisible before the furious Gorgons reached the altar. They slashed wildly through the empty air, smashing ancient stone into clouds of dust. Yet every desperate attack struck only silence. Fastening the kibyssus securely across his shoulder, Perseus launched himself upward as the winged sandals lifted him effortlessly above the shattered sanctuary. Below him, the two immortal sisters continued searching desperately, unable to understand how their enemy had vanished without leaving the slightest trace behind. Higher and higher Perseus climbed until the lonely valley disappeared beneath drifting clouds. Only then did he allow himself one slow breath of relief. The impossible mission given by King Polydectes had been completed. Medusa, whose name had terrified generations of heroes, was no more. Yet Perseus understood that his journey was far from over. Ahead still waited new kingdoms, new monsters, new prophecies, and a meeting with a princess whose fate had already become intertwined with his own, long before either of them had ever been born. Perseus flew higher than any mortal had ever travelled before, the divine winged sandals carrying him swiftly above endless mountains, silent deserts, and the glittering waters of distant seas, while the sacred kibyssus remained securely fastened across his shoulder. Hidden safely inside the enchanted pouch rested the severed head of Medusa, still possessing the terrible power that had turned countless living creatures into stone. Far below, the lonely valley of the Gorgons gradually disappeared beneath drifting clouds, until it became nothing more than a dark scar upon the forgotten landscape. For the first time since accepting King Polydectes' impossible challenge, Perseus allowed himself to breathe deeply, without the constant fear of meeting Medusa's deadly gaze. Yet relief never lasted long during the lives of Greek heroes. The gods had guided him safely through one impossible trial, but fate rarely rewarded its chosen champions with peaceful journeys home. The ancient world still held many mysteries waiting beyond the horizon, and the road back to Seriphos would become almost as legendary as the dangerous quest that had carried him westward. As he soared across unfamiliar lands, Perseus often found his thoughts returning not to the victory he had achieved, but to the lonely figure of Medusa herself. He remembered the silent ruins, the endless valley filled with forgotten statues, and the quiet sadness hidden beneath the terrifying appearance that generations had feared. Ancient myths often speak of monsters, yet they also remind us that tragedy and monstrosity are not always the same thing. Medusa had been defeated, but her story would never be forgotten. Even thousands of years later, artists, poets, and historians would continue asking the same question that lingered quietly within Perseus's own heart as he travelled through the skies. Was she born evil, or had fate transformed her into something she herself never wished to become? No answer came with the wind. Only the endless silence of the heavens accompanied him as the world stretched endlessly beneath his feet. Hours passed before the landscape below slowly began changing once again. The endless rocky wilderness surrounding the Gorgons gave way to broad golden deserts, where enormous dunes rolled toward every horizon like frozen waves upon an ancient sea. Rivers carved brilliant green paths through otherwise barren lands, feeding clusters of palm trees that appeared almost miraculous amid the endless sand. Strange animals wandered across the open plains, creatures unlike anything Perseus had ever seen growing up upon the islands of Greece. Merchant caravans moved slowly between distant settlements, their tiny figures barely visible from the height at which the winged sandals carried him. The world seemed unimaginably vast. Every new land possessed different mountains, different skies, different people, and different stories waiting to be told. Ancient Greek travelers often imagined the earth as a collection of extraordinary regions, connected not merely by roads, but by myths, where every distant kingdom held its own mysteries, shaped by the gods. Flying alone through those endless skies, Perseus realized how little even the wisest Greeks truly knew about the enormous world surrounding them. His own adventure had already carried him farther than almost any ordinary sailor or merchant could ever hope to travel during an entire lifetime. Yet somewhere ahead, another remarkable encounter quietly awaited him, one that would forever reshape both the landscape itself and another of Greek mythology's oldest legends. Late in the afternoon, Perseus noticed something extraordinary rising from the western horizon. At first, he mistook it for an enormous mountain whose peak vanished among the clouds. As he drew closer, however, the strange shape slowly revealed itself to be something entirely different. Standing upon a lonely plain at the edge of the world was a gigantic figure so immense that the tallest mountains seemed almost small beside him. His feet rested firmly upon the earth, while his broad shoulders reached upward toward the heavens themselves. Powerful arms stretched endlessly above his head, supporting the great dome of the sky as though it were an invisible weight carried across eternity. This was Atlas, one of the mighty Titans who had ruled long before Zeus and the Olympian gods claimed control of the universe. According to the oldest Greek traditions, Atlas had fought beside the Titans during their terrible war against Olympus. When the younger gods finally emerged victorious, Zeus punished Atlas with an extraordinary burden. Rather than casting him into the depths of Tartarus alongside many of the other defeated Titans, he condemned Atlas to stand forever at the western edge of the earth, supporting the heavens upon his shoulders for all eternity. It was a punishment unlike any other. Atlas could never sit. He could never sleep peacefully. He could never abandon his endless task, not even for a single moment. Century after century passed while kingdoms rose and disappeared, generations lived and died, and even heroes became legends. Yet Atlas remained exactly where Zeus had placed him, silently carrying the sky itself. Perseus landed respectfully some distance away before approaching the enormous Titan on foot. Looking upward, he realized that Atlas's face alone seemed larger than an ordinary house. His long beard flowed down his chest like a silver waterfall, while deep lines marked features that had witnessed the birth of countless generations. Despite his unimaginable size, there was something profoundly weary about him. Endless centuries beneath the weight of the heavens had slowly carved exhaustion into every part of his immortal expression. Perseus bowed politely before speaking. "Great Atlas," he called, his voice sounding surprisingly small beneath the vast open sky. "I am Perseus, son of Zeus. I have traveled a very long way and ask only for a little rest before continuing my journey home." Atlas slowly lowered his gaze toward the young hero standing at his feet. For several long moments, the Titan remained silent, before finally answering with a voice so deep that the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath every word. "Son of Zeus," he replied slowly, "I know who you are, and I know what you carry." Perseus instinctively tightened his grip upon the Pegasus resting across his shoulder. He had spoken to no one about Medusa since leaving the Valley of the Gorgons. Yet beings as ancient as Atlas often possessed knowledge far beyond ordinary understanding. The Titan continued quietly. "Long ago, another prophecy reached my ears. It declared that one day a son of Zeus would come seeking shelter, and because of him, my greatest treasure would be lost forever." Ancient myths sometimes preserve different versions of this prophecy, with some claiming it concerned the famous golden apples growing within Atlas's sacred garden. Whatever the exact wording may have been, fear had taken root within the old Titan's heart, just as it once had within King Acrisius. Rather than offering kindness to the weary traveler standing before him, Atlas slowly shook his enormous head. "You may not remain here," he declared firmly. "Leave this place immediately." Perseus looked at the weary Titan with quiet disappointment rather than anger. Throughout his journey, strangers had repeatedly shown him unexpected kindness. Dictys had rescued him from the sea as an infant. The Nymphs had freely entrusted him with divine treasures. Even the gods themselves had guided him when every path seemed impossible. He had hoped that Atlas, despite carrying such an extraordinary burden, might spare a little compassion for another traveler far from home. Instead, the ancient Titan had allowed fear to overcome generosity, just as King Acrisius and King Polydectes had done before him. Perseus asked only once more. "I seek neither your kingdom nor your treasures," he said calmly. "Only a place to rest before sunrise." Atlas's expression hardened. "Go," he thundered, "before I force you to leave." The great Titan took one slow step forward, the earth shaking beneath the enormous weight of his movement. Although Perseus respected Atlas deeply, he understood there would be no peaceful agreement. Then he remembered what rested safely inside the enchanted Pegasus. Slowly, he loosened the magical pouch and carefully withdrew the severed head of Medusa, never once allowing himself to meet its deadly eyes. "Forgive me," he whispered quietly. Then, turning the terrible face toward the advancing Titan, he held it aloft for only the briefest instant. The transformation happened almost immediately. Atlas froze where he stood. His enormous body grew perfectly still as the ancient curse flowed through every part of his immortal form. Stone spread upward from his feet, across his mighty legs, through his vast chest, and finally into the great arms still supporting the heavens above. His flowing beard became rivers of grey rock. His powerful shoulders expanded into towering cliffs. His outstretched arms rose higher and higher until they formed the peaks of an enormous mountain range, stretching across the western horizon. Thus, according to one of the oldest Greek legends, Atlas himself became the mighty Atlas Mountains, forever supporting the sky, exactly as he had before, but now as part of the earth itself rather than a living titan. Perseus quietly lowered the head of Medusa and placed it safely back inside the kibyssus. Looking toward the vast mountains rising where Atlas had once stood, he felt no triumph, only sadness. Once again, fear of prophecy had destroyed another life. Turning away from the silent mountains, Perseus fastened the winged sandals securely around his ankles and rose once more into the endless sky. Far ahead, beyond deserts, rivers, and distant seas, another destiny was already unfolding. Upon a lonely coastline, a young princess named Andromeda stood chained to a great rock beside the sea, completely unaware that the hero flying toward her would soon change both of their lives forever. Perseus continued flying eastward for many hours, leaving the newly formed Atlas Mountains far behind as the winged sandals carried him effortlessly above deserts that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun like endless oceans of gold. From such extraordinary heights, the world unfolded beneath him in ways no ordinary traveler could ever witness. Great rivers wound through fertile valleys like shining silver ribbons, while distant cities appeared no larger than clusters of tiny white stones scattered across the earth. Merchant caravans crawled slowly across the desert, their long lines of camels casting narrow shadows beneath the blazing sun, and fishing boats drifted peacefully along coastlines, where gentle waves rolled endlessly towards sandy beaches. Yet despite the remarkable beauty stretching beneath him, Perseus could not completely relax. Resting safely within the enchanted kibyssus, hung across his shoulder, remained the severed head of Medusa, one of the most dangerous objects ever to exist in Greek mythology. Every movement reminded him of the responsibility he now carried. He thought often of returning to Seriphos, where his mother still waited, unaware that her son had already accomplished what generations of heroes believed impossible. He imagined the surprise upon Danae's face when she finally saw him walking safely toward their small home beside the harbour. He imagined King Polydectes' expression when the impossible gift he had demanded was placed before him. Those peaceful thoughts helped carry Perseus through the long hours of flight, yet destiny, once again, had prepared another path before he could ever reach home. As the sun slowly drifted toward the western horizon, Perseus noticed something unusual far below, along a rugged coastline bordering a brilliant blue sea. At first, he believed he had discovered another ordinary fishing village, resting peacefully beside the water. Yet the closer he descended, the stranger the scene became. Hundreds of people had gathered upon the rocky shoreline, forming silent crowds that stretched from the edge of the sea toward the walls of a magnificent coastal city. No music echoed through the air, no merchants called from busy marketplaces. Instead, every face carried unmistakable sorrow. Men, women, and children stood quietly, watching the sea with expressions of fear and helplessness. Some wept openly, while others knelt upon the sand, offering desperate prayers toward the heavens. The atmosphere felt unlike anything Perseus had encountered since leaving Greece. It resembled neither celebration nor ordinary mourning. Rather, it carried the heavy silence of people waiting for something terrible they believed could no longer be prevented. Curious, Perseus circled lower until another remarkable sight immediately caught his attention. Far out upon a great rocky cliff extending into the sea stood a single young woman chained securely to the bare stone. The waves crashed endlessly around the isolated outcrop, while the girl remained completely alone, unable even to move away from the water rising slowly beneath her feet. Her long dark hair flowed gently in the evening breeze, and although the distance prevented Perseus from seeing her face clearly, he recognized at once that she was no criminal awaiting punishment. There was something deeply tragic about the stillness with which she accepted her fate. No guard stood beside her. No executioner waited nearby. She had simply been abandoned there, left to face whatever horror the sea would soon deliver. Perseus landed quietly upon a nearby hillside before approaching several elderly fishermen standing at the edge of the crowd. "Why has that young woman been chained upon the rocks?" he asked gently. The oldest fisherman looked toward the sea before answering in a weary voice. "She is Princess Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia." Perseus frowned in confusion. What crime has she committed? The old man slowly shook his head. None. Then, after a long sigh, he began telling the tragic story known throughout the kingdom. Queen Cassiopeia, celebrated for her extraordinary beauty, had allowed pride to overcome wisdom. One day she publicly declared that she herself, and in some versions her daughter Andromeda as well, were more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs beloved by Poseidon. Such arrogance deeply offended both the Nereids and the mighty god of the sea himself. Throughout Greek mythology, excessive pride toward the gods often brought devastating consequences, a lesson repeated again and again in stories told across the ancient world. Poseidon responded not by striking Cassiopeia alone, but by punishing the entire kingdom. Great storms battered the coastline, floodwaters destroyed farms, fishing boats disappeared beneath monstrous waves. Finally, from the deepest waters of the sea, Poseidon sent a terrifying sea monster known as Cetus, whose enormous body devastated villages and consumed everything that crossed its path. Desperate to save his people, King Cepheus travelled to the Oracle of Ammon seeking guidance. The answer returned colder than any winter wind. Only one sacrifice could end the suffering. Princess Andromeda must be offered to the monster. Hearing these words, Perseus looked once again toward the lonely figure chained upon the rocks. She had committed no crime. She was paying for the pride of another. For a long time, Perseus remained silent, watching the endless waves crash against the cliff where Andromeda waited. Ancient myths often place innocent people at the center of tragedies created by the mistakes of others. Standing upon the shore, Perseus found himself remembering his own mother. Danae, too, had suffered because of another person's fear. She had been imprisoned despite committing no wrong. She had been cast into the sea because King Acrisius feared a prophecy rather than trusting justice. Looking toward Andromeda, Perseus recognized the same quiet helplessness he had imagined Danae must once have felt drifting alone inside the wooden chest across the open sea. Without another word, he walked directly toward King Cepheus, who stood surrounded by grieving advisors near the water's edge. The elderly king looked utterly broken. His royal robes hung heavily upon his shoulders, while endless sleepless nights had carved deep lines across his face. Perseus bowed respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty," he said calmly, "must your daughter truly die?" Tears gathered in the king's eyes as he answered. "If she does not, thousands more of my people will perish. I have searched for another way, but the oracle offered none." Perseus looked toward the lonely princess once again before asking one final question. "If I defeat the monster and save her, will you allow Andromeda to choose her own future?" King Cepheus stared at the young stranger in astonishment. No warrior had ever volunteered to face Cetus. Even the kingdom's bravest soldiers refused to approach the sea whenever the monster appeared. "If you truly save my daughter," the king answered slowly, "I swear before the gods themselves that she shall be free, and if she wishes it, I will gladly give her hand in marriage." Perseus nodded quietly. He asked for no treasure, no land, no crown. Saving one innocent life was reason enough. The sky had begun glowing with the warm colours of sunset when the sea suddenly changed. Gentle waves rolling peacefully toward the shore only moments earlier became strangely restless. Seabirds, circling high above the cliffs, cried out in alarm before flying rapidly inland. A powerful wind swept across the coastline, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and deep ocean currents. Then came the sound. At first it resembled distant thunder rolling somewhere far beyond the horizon. Yet with every passing second, it grew louder until the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the feet of everyone gathered along the shore. The sea began to rise. Enormous waves crashed violently against the rocks where Andromeda remained chained. soaking her white robes while she lifted her face toward the darkening sky with remarkable calm. Out beyond the breakers, something vast slowly emerged from the depths. The surface of the water exploded upward as an enormous head broke through the waves. Massive jaws, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth, opened wide enough to swallow an entire fishing boat in one bite. Long scales shimmered dark green beneath the fading sunlight, while two enormous yellow eyes fixed themselves upon the helpless princess waiting upon the cliff. The monstrous Cetus had arrived. A cry of terror swept through the gathered crowd as families hurried farther from the shore. Some covered their faces, unable to watch what they believed would become another hopeless tragedy. King Cepheus himself fell to his knees, unable to bear the sight of his only daughter facing such unimaginable horror. Yet high above the frightened kingdom, another figure had already taken to the sky. Perseus tightened the straps of Hermes' winged sandals, adjusted the cabesus across his shoulder, drew the divine sword that had already defeated Medusa herself, and soared silently toward the roaring sea monster. The greatest battle since the slaying of the Gorgon was about to begin, while Princess Andromeda watched in astonishment as an unknown hero descended from the heavens, like a messenger sent by the gods themselves. Perseus shot through the evening sky like a solitary eagle gliding upon the wind, the divine winged sandals carrying him effortlessly above the crashing waves, while the frightened people gathered along the shore watched in complete disbelief. Never before had they seen a man fly. Against the glowing colours of the setting sun, his figure seemed almost unreal. A lone warrior suspended between the heavens and the sea, moving with remarkable calm toward a monster that had already destroyed villages, shattered ships, and filled an entire kingdom with despair. Below him, the enormous body of Cetus continued rising from the depths. Every movement of the creature displaced vast amounts of water, creating waves that crashed violently against the cliffs where Princess Andromeda remained chained. The sea monster's long neck curved upward like a gigantic serpent emerging from the ocean, while its immense body stretched far beneath the surface, so enormous that no one standing upon the shore could see where it truly ended. Ancient Greek artists often imagined Cetus not as a simple whale, nor as an ordinary sea serpent, but as a terrifying combination of many creatures at once. Possessing the powerful jaws of a crocodile, the scaled body of an immense dragon, enormous fins that churned the sea into white foam, and a tail capable of smashing great ships into splinters with a single strike. Whether such a creature ever existed outside mythology mattered little to those standing upon the shoreline. To them, the monster was terrifyingly real, and within only a few moments it would reach the helpless princess waiting upon the lonely rock. Perseus looked down through the clear evening air, studying the monster carefully, instead of rushing blindly into battle. Chiron had always taught his students that wisdom must guide every sword. Heroes who attacked without understanding their enemy rarely lived long enough to become legends. The monster suddenly opened its enormous jaws, releasing a deafening roar that echoed across the coastline with such tremendous force that flocks of seabirds exploded into the sky while loose stones tumbled from the surrounding cliffs. The sound itself seemed to shake the air. Below, Andromeda remained remarkably calm, despite the unimaginable terror unfolding before her. She had already accepted death long before the monster appeared, believing her sacrifice would save her father's kingdom. Yet now, as she looked upward, she saw an extraordinary sight descending from the heavens. A young warrior carrying a gleaming bronze shield flew directly toward the creature without the slightest sign of hesitation. For one brief moment, hope, something she believed forever lost, quietly returned to her heart. Perseus circled high above Cetus rather than attacking immediately. The monster's size presented a challenge unlike anything he had ever faced. Medusa had been dangerous because of her curse. Cetus possessed something much simpler, yet equally terrifying: overwhelming physical strength. One careless strike from its massive tail could send even a flying hero plunging into the sea below. As Perseus completed another wide circle overhead, he noticed the creature's movements becoming increasingly aggressive. Its attention had shifted entirely away from Andromeda. The flying stranger now represented the greater threat. Cetus raised its enormous head toward the sky before suddenly launching itself upward with astonishing speed, its gigantic jaws snapping shut only a few feet beneath Perseus. as the hero narrowly avoided the attack by climbing higher into the evening air. The people watching from the shore gasped collectively, convinced the battle had ended almost as soon as it began. Yet Perseus remained perfectly composed. He had learned something valuable. The monster could leap surprisingly high, but only for a brief moment before crashing heavily back into the sea. Again, Perseus circled patiently above the waves, refusing to allow excitement or fear to control his actions. Ancient Greek heroes often succeed not because they are stronger than their enemies, but because they understand them more quickly. Each time Cetus attacked, Perseus observed carefully. The enormous creature always struck with incredible force, but every attack required several moments before it could turn its gigantic body around for another attempt. Those brief pauses created tiny opportunities, almost invisible to anyone else. Perseus waited. The monster roared again before lunging skyward for a second time. This time, just as the enormous jaws opened beneath him, Perseus darted sharply to one side, allowing the creature's tremendous momentum to carry it harmlessly past. In the same instant, he swept downward beside the monster's long neck and struck with Hermes' divine sword. The enchanted blade sliced cleanly through several enormous scales before Perseus immediately soared back into the sky, beyond the reach of the monster's thrashing tail. Dark blood spilled into the sea beneath, colouring the surrounding waves deep crimson. Cetus bellowed with fury, twisting violently as pain, unlike anything it had previously experienced, spread through its massive body. Yet, the wound remained small compared to the creature's extraordinary size. Perseus understood immediately that defeating such a beast would require patience rather than reckless courage. One successful strike would never be enough. High above the battlefield, he quietly remembered the countless hours spent hunting wild goats among the rocky hills of Seriphos. Chiron had often reminded young heroes that exhausting a powerful enemy sometimes proved wiser than confronting its full strength directly. Perseus intended to do exactly that. For what seemed like an eternity, the remarkable battle continued above the darkening sea. Again and again, Cetus hurled itself upward with terrifying violence, while Perseus remained just beyond reach, using the speed of Hermes' winged sandals to weave gracefully through the evening sky. Each failed attack drained a little more of the monster's enormous strength. Each powerful leap ended with another thunderous crash back into the ocean, sending towering walls of water racing toward the shore. The people watching below scarcely dared to breathe. Never had they witnessed combat so unlike ordinary warfare. There were no armies, no ranks of soldiers, no clashing shields, only one young hero circling endlessly above a furious sea monster, whose strength slowly began giving way to exhaustion. As twilight deepened across the horizon, Perseus noticed the creature's movements becoming slightly slower. Its attacks no longer carried the same terrifying speed. Heavy breathing echoed across the water, while blood continued flowing from the wounds already opened by Hermes' divine sword. At last, the opportunity Chiron would have recognized finally appeared. Cetus reared upward once more, but this time its enormous neck remained fully exposed, for a heartbeat longer than before. Perseus folded his wings slightly, diving toward the monster with extraordinary speed. Wind roared past his ears as he descended. The sea rushed upward beneath him. At the final possible instant, he raised the divine sword with both hands and drove its gleaming blade deep into the monster's throat, just below the massive jaw. The enchanted weapon pierced scales that no ordinary bronze could ever have broken. Cetus released one final earth-shaking roar before collapsing backward into the sea. Enormous waves spread outward across the coastline as the gigantic body slowly disappeared beneath the dark water. For several long moments, no one upon the shore moved. Then the sea gradually became calm once again. Silence settled over the kingdom. The terrible monster was gone. Slowly, almost as though afraid the miracle might vanish if they moved too quickly, the people gathered along the shore began realizing what had truly happened. Their years of fear had ended. Their children no longer faced destruction. Their villages would never again tremble beneath the approach of Cetus. A single voice cried out in celebration, then another. Within moments, the entire coastline erupted with overwhelming joy. Men embraced one another. Women wept openly with relief. Children laughed as the impossible finally became reality before their eyes. King Cepheus fell to his knees, thanking the gods for the stranger who had appeared from the heavens when every hope had already been lost. Yet, Perseus paid little attention to the celebration rising behind him. Instead, he landed gently upon the lonely rock where Andromeda still remained chained. For the first time, they stood face to face. The young princess looked at the quiet hero with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. She had expected death. Instead, she had witnessed a miracle. Without speaking, Perseus carefully drew his sword and cut through the heavy iron chains binding her wrists and ankles. As the final link fell harmlessly upon the stone, Andromeda took her first free step in many hours. The sea breeze gently carried her hair, while the last golden light of the setting sun reflected across the calm water behind them. Their meeting felt strangely peaceful after the violence of the battle. Sometimes the oldest Greek storytellers remind us, the greatest moments in a hero's life do not arrive with thunder or glory, but with quiet kindness shared between two strangers whose destinies have finally crossed. As the final light of the evening slowly disappeared beyond the western horizon, Perseus and Andromeda walked together from the lonely rock back toward the waiting shoreline, where an entire kingdom stood in stunned silence. Only moments earlier, every person gathered there had expected to witness the tragic death of their beloved princess. Instead, they had seen the impossible unfold before their eyes. The terrible sea monster that had haunted their coast for years had vanished forever beneath the waves, defeated by a single unknown traveler who had descended from the sky itself. At first, no one dared move, almost afraid that the vision before them might disappear like a dream at sunrise. Then, as Andromeda stepped safely onto the beach beside Perseus, the silence finally broke. Cheers rolled across the coastline like another great wave. Children rushed forward, laughing through tears, while elderly men embraced one another, after believing they would never again see peace return to their homeland. Mothers held their children tightly, grateful that no more innocent lives would be offered to satisfy the anger of the sea. Fishermen who had abandoned their boats months earlier looked once again toward the calm water with hope instead of fear. For the first time in many years, the kingdom could breathe freely. Yet while everyone celebrated the end of their suffering, Perseus remained remarkably humble. He accepted neither praise nor extravagant titles. Throughout his journey, he had learned that true heroes rarely seek glory for its own sake. The greatest victories belong not to pride, but to those whose actions quietly restore hope where fear once ruled. King Cephas approached the young hero with slow, grateful steps, his eyes filled with emotion too deep for ordinary words. For a long moment he simply looked at Perseus, before embracing him, as though welcoming back a long-lost son. "You have saved not only my daughter," the king whispered, "but every family in this kingdom. Nothing I possess can ever truly repay such a gift." Queen Cassiopeia, whose pride had begun the entire tragedy, stood nearby with tears silently running down her face. Ancient Greek myths often remind us that even the most powerful rulers must eventually face the consequences of arrogance. Looking upon her rescued daughter, Cassiopeia finally understood that beauty fades, wealth disappears, and kingdoms rise and fall. But humility remains one of the greatest virtues any person can possess. She quietly thanked Perseus without attempting to excuse the mistake that had nearly destroyed everyone she loved. Standing beside her parents, Andromeda looked toward the young hero whose name she had learned only moments before. Until that day, Perseus had been nothing more than a stranger flying across distant skies. Now he had become the man who willingly risked his own life for someone he had never met. Ancient storytellers often describe love arriving suddenly through extraordinary events. Yet, in many of the oldest Greek traditions, the affection growing between Perseus and Andromeda developed far more gently. It began not with grand speeches or impossible promises, but with quiet admiration, mutual respect, and gratitude born from shared courage during humanity's darkest moments. Several days later, the kingdom celebrated not one joyful occasion, but two. First came the festival honoring the defeat of the sea monster, during which temples throughout the land offered thanks to the Olympian gods for finally lifting Poseidon's terrible punishment. Music once again filled the marketplaces. Fishing boats returned safely to the sea. Farmers reopened fields, abandoned during years of destruction. Children who had grown accustomed to stories of fear now laughed freely while running through streets decorated with flowers and colourful banners. Soon afterward came the wedding of Perseus and Andromeda. an event remembered by generations of Greek poets as one of mythology's happiest celebrations. Guests arrived from neighboring kingdoms carrying magnificent gifts, while musicians filled the palace with songs celebrating the hero who had crossed the edge of the known world, defeated Medusa herself, and rescued a princess from certain death. Yet, according to several ancient traditions, peace did not last even during the wedding feast. A former suitor of Andromeda named Phineus believed the princess had already been promised to him before Perseus appeared. Consumed by jealousy and anger, he entered the celebration, accompanied by armed followers, demanding that the marriage immediately be stopped. What began as a joyful feast suddenly descended toward violence. Swords left their scabbards. Guests hurried to protect the royal family while chaos spread throughout the great hall. Perseus fought bravely, but he knew that many innocent people would die if the battle continued. Finally, with deep reluctance, he reached once again for the sacred Pegasus. Carefully withdrawing the head of Medusa while keeping his own eyes safely turned away, he raised it toward the attacking warriors. Within seconds, Phineus and those still advancing toward him became silent stone statues, frozen forever where they stood. The terrible power of Medusa had ended the conflict almost instantly. Perseus gently returned the sacred head to the enchanted pouch, silently hoping he would never again need to use such a dreadful weapon. Victory purchased through fear always carried a heavy price. When the celebrations finally ended, Perseus realized that one final duty still awaited him far across the sea. Danae remained upon Seriphos, still living under the unwanted attention of King Polydectes, and completely unaware that her son had survived every impossible trial. Together, Perseus and Andromeda began the long journey back toward the peaceful island where his extraordinary adventure had first begun. Although the road home carried none of the terrifying dangers that had marked the earlier stages of his quest, it offered something perhaps even more precious: time. During long evenings beneath quiet stars, the newly married couple spoke about the many experiences that had shaped their lives before destiny brought them together. Perseus told Andromeda about his childhood upon Seriphos, about the kindness of Dictys, the wisdom of Athena, the clever guidance of Hermes, and the lonely valley where countless heroes had become stone. Andromeda shared memories of growing up beside the sea, of watching her parents struggle beneath Poseidon's punishment, and of the lonely hours spent chained to the cliffs, believing she would never again see another sunrise. Slowly, the two strangers who had first met beside the crashing waves became true companions. Ancient Greek storytellers understood that the greatest journeys are rarely measured only by the monsters defeated or treasures won. They are measured equally by the people who choose to walk beside us afterward. At last, the familiar outline of Seriphos appeared upon the horizon, exactly as Perseus remembered it from childhood. Gentle hills rolled down toward the quiet harbour, where fishing boats rested peacefully upon calm blue water. White cottages shone beneath the warm Mediterranean sun, and seabirds circled lazily above the shoreline, exactly as they had done when Perseus first left the island many months before. Yet beneath the peaceful appearance, little had changed for Danae. King Polydectes had never abandoned his desire to force her into marriage. Believing Perseus long dead, the king had grown even more confident that no one remained capable of protecting her. Danae herself had taken refuge within a temple dedicated to the gods, trusting that even an ambitious ruler would hesitate before violating sacred ground. Dictys remained faithfully beside her, offering comfort whenever fear threatened to overwhelm hope. Neither of them knew that the young man they believed lost beyond the edge of the world had already returned, carrying proof that impossible promises can indeed be fulfilled. As Perseus stepped quietly onto the familiar shore, he paused for a single moment, looking across the peaceful island where his life had truly begun. The sea breeze carried memories of childhood laughter, humble fishing boats, and the simple kindness that had shaped the person he had become. He smiled gently, knowing that the final chapter of his remarkable journey was about to unfold. Yet, hidden far beyond even this joyful reunion, another prophecy continued waiting patiently for the day it too would be fulfilled, proving once again that in Greek mythology, destiny never truly forgets the promises spoken long ago by the gods. Perseus and Andromeda sailed steadily across the calm waters of the Aegean Sea. The familiar outline of Seriphos slowly emerged upon the distant horizon, glowing softly beneath the warm light of the early morning sun. Gentle waves rolled peacefully against the wooden hull, while a cool sea breeze carried with it the unmistakable scent of salt, pine trees, and distant olive groves. Months earlier, Perseus had departed from these same shores with nothing except a promise, a simple bronze sword, and a mission that every person on the island believed would end in certain death. No farewell celebration had accompanied his departure. No crowd had gathered to wish him success, because almost no one expected him to return. Yet now he sailed home, not as the uncertain young fisherman who had left Seriphos, but as the hero who had crossed the edge of the known world, defeated Medusa, escaped the immortal Gorgons, rescued Princess Andromeda, slain the monstrous Cetus, and fulfilled an impossible task that had already become the subject of whispered stories among sailors travelling across the Mediterranean. Despite everything he had accomplished, Perseus felt no pride as the island grew larger before his eyes. Instead, his thoughts remained fixed upon only two people, his mother, Danae, who had waited anxiously every day since his departure, and the kind fisherman Dictys, whose generosity had saved both mother and child so many years earlier when fate first carried them to Seriphos inside a drifting wooden chest. Before confronting kings or settling old debts, Perseus wished only to see the people who had given him a home when he possessed nothing at all. The small harbour looked almost unchanged since the day he had left. Fishing boats rocked gently beside weathered wooden docks, while fishermen repaired their nets exactly as they had done throughout his childhood. Children laughed while chasing one another between rows of white stone cottages, and elderly sailors sat beneath the shade of olive trees, exchanging stories about distant voyages and changing weather. For one peaceful moment, it seemed as though time itself had stood still. Yet beneath the calm appearance, Perseus soon noticed something deeply troubling. The cheerful atmosphere he remembered from his youth had faded. Conversations stopped whenever groups of islanders noticed unfamiliar visitors approaching the village. Faces that should have reflected ordinary happiness instead carried quiet anxiety. Many people lowered their voices before speaking, often glancing nervously toward the royal palace standing upon the hill above the harbour. It did not take long before an elderly fisherman recognized the young hero. At first, the old man simply stared in disbelief, rubbing his eyes as though uncertain whether the figure standing before him truly existed. Then, with a trembling voice filled equally with amazement and joy, he whispered a single name: Perseus. Within moments, the news spread rapidly through the village. Men abandoned their fishing nets, women hurried from their homes, children gathered curiously around the stranger everyone had believed dead. One after another, they approached carefully, almost afraid that touching him might cause the wonderful vision to disappear, like morning mist beneath the rising sun. Smiles slowly replaced months of sadness. Some embraced him warmly, others simply stood speechless, unable to believe that the impossible had actually happened. Perseus greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness they had always known. He accepted no praise, asking only one question: "Where is my mother?" The joyful expressions surrounding him slowly faded. Several villagers exchanged uneasy glances before one elderly woman finally stepped forward. "Your mother is alive," she answered softly, "but she no longer lives peacefully." Perseus immediately felt his heart grow heavy. The woman explained that after many months had passed without news of his return, King Polydectes had become completely convinced that the impossible journey had claimed Perseus's life. Believing himself finally free from the young man who had always stood between him and Danae, the king renewed his efforts to force her into marriage. Day after day, royal messengers arrived, demanding that she accept his proposal. When persuasion failed, threats soon followed. Refusing to surrender her freedom, Danae sought sanctuary inside a sacred temple where ancient custom forbade violence or arrest. Dictys remained beside her throughout the entire ordeal, protecting her as best he could despite the growing anger of his own brother. Hearing these words, Perseus closed his eyes for a brief moment. The long journey across the world, every danger faced, every sacrifice endured, had all been undertaken so that his mother might finally live without fear. Yet even after defeating Medusa, she still suffered beneath the ambition of another king. Quietly thanking the villagers for their honesty, Perseus immediately made his way toward the temple where Danae had taken refuge. The ancient sanctuary stood upon a gentle hill overlooking the sea, surrounded by tall cypress trees whose branches swayed softly beneath the afternoon breeze. It had always been regarded as sacred ground, a place where those seeking protection could appeal directly to the gods. As Perseus slowly climbed the worn stone steps leading toward its entrance, memories from childhood returned one after another. He remembered climbing these same hills with Dictys, gathering wildflowers for his mother, and watching ships disappear beyond the distant horizon while imagining the mysterious lands lying far beyond the sea. Now, after truly traveling farther than almost any Greek of his generation, he returned, not as a curious child, but as a man shaped by extraordinary adventures. Inside the quiet temple, Danae knelt alone before the altar, offering silent prayers exactly as she had done every day since Perseus departed. She prayed not for wealth or revenge, but simply that wherever her son might be, the gods would grant him peace. Soft footsteps echoed gently across the ancient floor behind her. Believing another priest had entered the sanctuary, she remained kneeling until a familiar voice quietly spoke only 2 words, "Mother, I'm home." For a moment, Danae did not move. She feared her own heart had begun imagining impossible things after so many months of loneliness. Slowly, she turned. There, standing beneath the warm afternoon light, streaming through the temple entrance, was the son she had believed she might never see again. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Without speaking another word, she rushed forward, embracing Perseus with all the strength she possessed. Neither mother nor son cared that tears flowed freely. Around them, the temple remained perfectly silent, as though even the gods themselves respectfully allowed the long-awaited reunion to unfold without interruption. Perseus held his mother tightly, remembering the frightened woman who had once drifted across the sea beside him inside a simple wooden chest. Together, they had survived kings, storms, monsters, prophecies, and impossible journeys. At last, for the first time in many years, they stood together again, without the shadow of separation hanging over them. Soon afterward, Dictys entered the temple, having heard astonishing rumors spreading rapidly throughout the island. The old fisherman stopped suddenly upon seeing Perseus alive. His weathered face broke into the broadest smile the young hero had ever seen. Without hesitation, the two embraced warmly, neither needing many words to express the gratitude they felt. Perseus quietly thanked the man who had rescued both him and Danae from the sea all those years ago. "Without your kindness," he said sincerely, "none of this would ever have happened." Dictys simply smiled and shook his head. "No," he answered gently, "the gods carried you here. I merely opened the lid." Together, they shared stories, long into the afternoon. Perseus described distant kingdoms, the Graeae, the Nymphs, Athena, Hermes, Medusa, Pegasus, Atlas, and Andromeda's rescue, while Dictys explained everything that had happened upon Seriphos during his absence. Eventually, silence returned. There remained one final task that could no longer be delayed. King Polydectes still believed Perseus dead. He still ruled through arrogance and fear. Most importantly, he had broken every principle of hospitality by abusing the very people who had trusted him. Perseus quietly rose to his feet. He lifted the enchanted kibisis onto his shoulder, fastening it carefully exactly as he had done countless times before. Looking toward Danae, he smiled reassuringly. "You will never have to hide again." Without anger clouding his face, without shouting and without drawing his sword, Perseus began walking calmly toward the royal palace, where King Polydectes continued celebrating a victory that had never truly been his. The final promise made upon the day of the great banquet was finally ready to be fulfilled. As the afternoon sun slowly descended toward the western horizon, Perseus walked calmly through the streets of Seriphos, with Andromeda beside him, and the enchanted kibisis resting quietly upon his shoulder. The islanders watched silently from their homes as the young man they had believed lost forever made his way toward the royal palace, where King Polydectes continued living as though nothing in the world could ever challenge his authority. Months earlier, that same king had laughed before the entire court when he demanded the impossible gift of Medusa's head, fully convinced the dangerous journey would remove Perseus from his life forever. Now, fate itself quietly approached his palace gates. The royal guards recognized Perseus immediately, and shock spread across their faces. Some stepped backward in disbelief, while others hurried inside to warn the king that the impossible had happened. By the time Perseus entered the great hall, every conversation had fallen silent. Noblemen who had attended the banquet many months earlier stared as though they had seen a ghost return from the underworld. King Polydectes himself rose slowly from his throne, unable to hide the astonishment upon his face. For several long moments, he simply looked at the young hero standing peacefully before him. Then, forcing a nervous smile, he spoke with false confidence. "So, you have returned alive." Perseus nodded quietly. "I have returned exactly as I promised." Laughter slowly spread among several members of the court, for although Perseus had survived, no one believed he could truly have accomplished the impossible task. Polydectes folded his arms across his chest before speaking loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Then where is my gift? Surely you have not forgotten the promise you made before every nobleman of Seriphos." Without the slightest trace of anger, Perseus carefully lowered the enchanted kibisis from his shoulder. "I never forget my promises," he answered calmly. "You asked for the head of Medusa. I have brought it to you." The laughter vanished immediately. Some believed Perseus merely wished to frighten the king with an empty threat. Others watched with growing uncertainty as the young hero slowly loosened the sacred pouch, exactly as the immortal Nymphs had taught him many months before. Perseus closed his own eyes for a brief moment, turning his face safely away before carefully lifting Medusa's terrible head from within the kibisis. Even in death, the snakes upon her head remained alive, twisting gently around one another, while the dreadful curse hidden within her golden eyes remained unchanged. "You wish to see the proof," Perseus said softly. "Then look." King Polydectes laughed one final time before turning directly toward the Gorgon's face. In that single instant, every sound within the palace disappeared. The king froze where he stood. His mocking smile remained forever upon his lips, while stone slowly spread across his body from head to foot. Around him, those noblemen who had joined his cruelty likewise became silent statues, their final expressions preserving forever the arrogance with which they had greeted the returning hero. Within only a few heartbeats, the magnificent royal hall stood completely still. Where moments earlier proud rulers had mocked Perseus, now remained only lifeless stone figures beneath the fading afternoon light. Perseus immediately returned Medusa's head to the safety of the enchanted kibisis, sealing the magical pouch once again before opening his eyes. He looked upon the silent hall without satisfaction or celebration. Throughout his journey, he had learned that terrible power always carried terrible responsibility. The Gorgon's head had ended in justice, yet it remained a weapon he hoped never again to use. Ancient Greek storytellers often remind us that even righteous victories leave behind quiet sadness. Perseus had not desired revenge. He had desired only freedom for those he loved. With Polydectes gone, the people of Seriphos quickly turned toward the one man who had always ruled through kindness rather than fear. Dictys, the humble fisherman whose compassion had once saved Danae and the infant Perseus from the sea, was chosen to become the island's new king. No one celebrated this decision more warmly than Perseus himself. Standing before the assembled people of Seriphos, he placed the royal staff into Dictys' weathered hands before saying, "The wisest rulers are often those who never sought a throne." Under Dictys' gentle leadership, the island slowly returned to the peaceful way of life Perseus remembered from childhood. Fishermen once again worked without fear, merchants traded freely, and Danae at last lived without hiding inside sacred temples. For several peaceful months, Perseus and Andromeda remained upon Seriphos, enjoying a happiness they had both earned through years of hardship. Yet one final journey still remained unfinished. Far across the sea lay the kingdom of Argos, where an old prophecy spoken before Perseus's birth still waited patiently for its final fulfillment. News of Perseus's remarkable adventures had spread across Greece, until eventually even King Acrisius heard astonishing rumors that his grandson still lived. Terror immediately filled the old king's heart. Believing he could still escape the words once spoken by the Oracle of Delphi, Acrisius abandoned Argos entirely and travelled far away, convinced that distance alone might defeat destiny. But Greek mythology teaches again and again that no mortal, however powerful, can outrun fate forever. Sometime later, Perseus journeyed to the city of Larissa to take part in magnificent athletic games, celebrating peace between neighbouring kingdoms. Athletes gathered from every corner of Greece to compete in wrestling, running, javelin throwing, boxing, and the discus, one of the oldest sporting contests in the ancient world. Thousands of spectators filled the great stadium beneath a brilliant summer sky, while musicians, merchants, and storytellers transformed the festival into a joyful celebration. Among the elderly visitors quietly watching the games from the crowd sat a traveller who had deliberately hidden his true identity. It was King Acrisius. Hoping never to encounter Perseus again, he had chosen Larissa, believing it safely removed from Argos. Neither grandfather nor grandson recognized one another among the countless spectators. During the discus competition, Perseus stepped confidently into the throwing circle. With smooth, practiced movement, he spun gracefully before releasing the heavy bronze discus high into the clear blue sky. The crowd followed its magnificent flight as the shining disc sailed farther than anyone expected. Then, carried slightly off course by a sudden gust of wind, it descended unexpectedly into the gathered spectators. A single cry echoed through the stadium. The discus struck an elderly man standing near the edge of the field. When people hurried forward, they discovered, to Perseus's overwhelming horror, that the injured stranger was none other than King Acrisius himself. The prophecy spoken before Perseus had even been born had finally come true. Not through hatred, not through revenge, not by deliberate choice, but through a tragic accident no human being could possibly have predicted or prevented. The weight of that moment remained with Perseus for the rest of his life. Although the throne of Argos now belonged to him by birth, he found no joy in claiming a kingdom gained through such sorrow. Instead, according to several ancient traditions, Perseus exchanged kingdoms with another ruler and eventually governed tyrants, believing it better to begin a new chapter than constantly remember the painful fulfillment of the prophecy. Together, Perseus and Andromeda ruled wisely for many years. Their children continued the famous line of heroes, from which, according to later Greek mythology, even Heracles himself would eventually descend. Before retiring from his greatest adventures, Perseus fulfilled one final sacred duty. He returned Medusa's head to Athena, whose wisdom had guided him from the beginning of his quest. The goddess placed the terrible face upon her magnificent shield, the Aegis, where it became both a symbol of divine protection and a reminder that wisdom will always triumph over reckless strength. As the years quietly passed, Perseus gradually became less a wandering hero and more a respected king, husband, father, and elder whose greatest adventures lived on in songs rather than daily life. When his earthly journey finally ended, Greek storytellers imagined the gods themselves honoring his extraordinary courage by placing both Perseus and Andromeda among the stars. Even today, on clear autumn nights across much of the world, the constellations bearing their names can still be seen shining quietly above us, continuing the ancient belief that the greatest heroes never truly disappear. Historians today continue to debate how much of Perseus's remarkable adventure may preserve distant memories of the ancient Mediterranean world. Some scholars believe Medusa's terrifying image reflected protective symbols carved upon temples and shields to frighten enemies and evil spirits. Others suggest the Gorgon represented forgotten local deities, whose stories slowly changed as Greek civilization expanded across new lands. Archaeologists have discovered countless images of Medusa decorating pottery, armor, coins, mosaics, and temple entrances throughout the ancient Greek world, proving that her story became one of the most powerful symbols of classical civilization. Whether Perseus himself ever truly lived can no longer be known with certainty, yet perhaps that question is less important than many people imagine. For nearly 3,000 years, this legend has survived because it speaks to something timeless within every generation. It reminds us that courage often begins with ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, that wisdom is stronger than pride, that compassion leaves a greater legacy than power, and that even when fate cannot be avoided, we still choose the kind of person we become while walking toward it. And now, dear friend, as the gentle waters of the Aegean grow quiet beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, our long journey through the legendary world of Perseus finally comes to its peaceful end. We have travelled together from the bronze prison beneath Argos to the lonely valley of Medusa, from the endless skies above the ancient world to the quiet shores where kingdoms found hope once more. Perhaps some of these events happened exactly as the old storytellers believed. Perhaps others slowly grew into legend as centuries passed from one generation to the next. Either way, the story has endured because every age continues to discover something meaningful within it. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening exploring one of Greece's greatest myths with me. If sleep has not yet found you, perhaps it is waiting just beyond the next gentle wave. Until our next journey into the forgotten world of ancient history and mythology, may your dreams be peaceful, your night be calm, and your rest be as quiet as the ancient sea beneath a sky full of timeless stars. Good night.